Chapter 9 of the Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 9. Strange Disclosures Are Made. The strange letter of Elma Heath, combined with what Lydia Moreton had told me, aroused within me a determination to investigate the mystery. From the moment I had landed from the Lola on that hot, breathless night at Leghorn, mystery had crowded upon mystery until it was all bewildering. It was now proved that the sweet-faced girl, the original of the torn photograph, held a secret, and that by her own words she knew that death was approaching. The incomprehensible attempt upon my life, the strange actions of Hornby and Chater, who, by the way, seemed to have entirely disappeared, the assassination of the man who by masquerading as the Italian waiter had met his death, and the murder of Olinto's wife were all problems which required solution. Had it not been for the mystery of it all, and mystery ever arouses the human curiosity, I should have given up trying to get at the truth. But as a man with some leisure, and knowing by that letter of Elma Heath's that she was in sore distress, I redoubled my efforts to ascertain the reason of it all. The mystery of the Lola was still a mystery along the Mediterranean. At every French and Italian port the yacht's false name and general build was written in the police books, while at Lloyd's the name Lola was marked down as among the mysterious craft at sea. Chater was missing, while Hornby was abroad. Perhaps they were both cruising again, with their yacht repainted and bearing a fresh name. But why? What had been their motive? Stirred by the complete mystery which now seemed to enshroud the unfortunate girl, I set before myself the task of elucidating it. Hitherto I had remained passive rather than active, but I now realized by that curious letter that at least one woman's life was at stake, that Elma Heath was in possession of some secret. On leaving Leghorn I had given up all hope of tracing the mysterious yachtsman, and had left the matter in the hands of the Italian police. But without any effort on my own part, I seemed to have been drawn into a veritable network of strange incidents, all of which combined to form the most complete and remarkable enigma ever presented in life. Surely no man was ever confronted by so many mysteries at one time as I was at this moment. Fortunately I had been careful not to show my hand to anyone, and this perhaps gave me a distinct advantage. On my journey back to London, as the train swung through Peterborough and out across the rich level lands towards Hitchin, I recollected Jack Durnford's words when I had mentioned the Lola. What, I wondered, did he know? Next month, in November, he was due back in London after his 3 years' service on the Mediterranean station. Then we should meet in a few weeks, I hoped. Would he tell me anything when he became aware of all I knew? He held some secret knowledge. Was it possible that his secret was the same as that held by the unfortunate girl in far-off, dreary Finland? I called at the house in Cork Street indicated by Elma, and learned from the old commissionaire, who acted as liftman and porter, that Mr. Woodroffe's chambers were closed. "He's nearly always away, sir. Abroad, I think," was all I could get out of the old soldier, who, like his class, was no doubt well paid to keep his mouth closed. For 2 days I lounged about Westbourne Grove, watching Ferrari's restaurant. In such a busy, bustling thoroughfare, with so many shop windows as excuses for loitering, the task was easy. I saw that Olinto came regularly at 10 o'clock in the morning, worked hard all day, and left at 9 o'clock at night, taking an omnibus home from Royal Oak. His exterior was calm and unconcerned, unlike that of a man whose devoted wife had disappeared. I would have approached him and explained the ghastly truth, had it not been for the fact that the poor woman's body was missing. Those September days were full of anxiety for me. Alone and unaided, I was trying to solve one of the greatest of problems, plunged as I was in a veritable sea of mystery. I wanted to see Muriel Leithcourt, and to question her further regarding Elma Heath. Therefore again I left Euston, and travelling through the night took my seat at the breakfast table at Greenlaw next morning. Sir George, who was sitting alone, it not being my aunt's habit to appear early, welcomed me, and then in his bluff manner sniffed and exclaimed, "Nice goings-on up at Rannoch. Have you heard of them?" "No. What?" I cried breathlessly, staring at him. "Well, my suspicions that those Leithcourts were utter outsiders turns out to be about correct." "Why?" "Well, it's a very funny story, and there are a dozen different distorted versions of it," he said. "But from what I can gather, the true facts are these. About 7 o'clock the night before last, as Leithcourt and his house party were dressing for dinner, a telegram arrived. Mrs. Leithcourt opened it and at once went off into hysterics, while her husband, in a breathless hurry, slipped off his evening clothes again and got into an old blue serge suit, tossed a few things into a bag, and then went along to Muriel's room to urge her to prepare for secret flight." "Flight!" I gasped. "What, have they gone?" "Listen, and I'll tell you. The servants have described the whole affair down in the village, so there's no doubt about it. Leithcourt showed Muriel the telegram and urged her to fly. At first she refused, but for her father's sake was induced to prepare to accompany him. Of course the guests were in ignorance of all this. The brougham was ordered to be ready in the stable yard, and not to go round, while Mrs. Leithcourt's maid tried to bring the lady back to her senses. Leithcourt himself, it seemed, rushed hither and thither, seizing the jewel cases of his wife and daughter, and whatever valuables he could place his hand upon, while the mother and daughter were putting on their things. As he rushed down the main staircase to the library, where his cheque-book and some ready cash were locked in the safe, he met a stranger who had just been admitted and shown into the room. Leithcourt closed the door and faced him. What afterwards transpired, however, is a mystery, for about 2 hours later, after he and the two women had escaped, leaving the house party to their own diversions, the stranger was found locked in a large cupboard and insensible. The sensation was a tremendous one. Cowan, the doctor, was called, and declared that the stranger had been drugged and was suffering from some narcotic. The servant who admitted him declared that the man had said he had an appointment with his master, and that no card was necessary. He, however, gave the name of Chater. "Chater!" I cried, starting up. "Are you certain of that name?" "I only know what Cowan told me," was my uncle's reply. "But do you know him?" "Not at all. Only I've heard that name before," I said. "I knew a man out in Italy of the same name. But where is the visitor now?" "In the hospital at Dumfries. They took him there in preference to leaving him alone at Rannoch." "Alone?" "Of course. Everyone has left. Now the host and hostess have slipped off without saying good-bye. Scandalous affair, isn't it? But, my boy, you'll remember that I always said I didn't like those people. There's something mysterious about them, I feel certain. That telegram gave them warning of the visit of the man Chater. Depend on it, and for some reason they're afraid of him. It would be interesting to know what transpired between the two men in the library. And these are people who've been taken up by everybody. Mere adventurers, I should call them." And old Sir George sniffed again at thought of such scandal happening in the neighborhood. If Gilray must let Rannoch, then why in the name of fortune doesn't he let it to respectable folk and not to the first fellow who answers his advertisement in the field? It's simply disgraceful." "Certainly it is a most extraordinary story," I declared. "Leithcourt evidently wished to escape from his visitor, and that's why he drugged him." "Why, he poisoned him, you mean? Cowan says the fellow is poisoned, but that he'll probably recover. He is already conscious, I hear." I resolved to call on the doctor, who happened to be well known to me, and obtain further particulars. Therefore, at 11 o'clock, I drove into Dumfries and entered his consulting room. He was a spare, short, fair man, a trifle bald, and when I was shown in he welcomed me warmly, speaking with his pronounced Galloway accent. "Well, it is a very mysterious case, Mr. Gregg," he said, after I had told him the object of my visit. "The gentleman is still in the hospital, and I have to keep him very quiet. He was poisoned without a doubt, and has had a very narrow escape of his life. The police got wind of the affair, and Mackenzie called to question him. But he refused to make any statement whatever, apparently treating the affair very lightly. The police, however, are mystified as to the reason of Mr. Leithcourt's sudden flight, and are anxious to get at the bottom of the curious affair. Naturally, and more especially after the tragedy up in Rannoch Wood a short time ago, I said. That's just it, said the doctor, removing his pince-nez and rubbing them. Mackenzie seems to suspect some connection between Leithcourt's sudden disappearance and that mysterious affair. It seems very evident that the telegram was a warning to Leithcourt of the man Chatter's intention of calling, and that the last named was shown in just at the moment when the fugitive was on the point of leaving. Chatter, I echoed. Do you know his Christian name? Hilton Chatter. He is apparently a gentleman. Curious that he will tell us nothing of the reason he called, and of the scene that occurred between them. Knowing all that I did, I was not surprised. Leithcourt had undoubtedly taken him unawares, but knights of industry never betray each other. My next visit was to Mackenzie, for whom I had to wait nearly an hour, as he was absent in another quarter of the town. "Ah, Mr. Gregg," he cried gladly as he came in to find me seated in a chair, patiently reading the newspaper. "You are the very person I wish to see. Have you heard of this strange affair at Rannoch?" "I have," was my answer. "Has the man in the hospital made any statement yet?" "None. He refuses point blank," answered the detective. "But my own idea is that the affair has a very close connection with the two mysteries of the wood." "The first mystery, that of the man, proves to be a double mystery," I said. "How? Explain it." "Well, the waiter Olinto Santini is alive and well in London." "What?" he gasped, starting up. "Then he is not the person you identified him to be?" "No. But he was masquerading as Santini, made up to resemble him, I mean, even to the mole upon his face." "But you identified him positively." "And when a person is dead, it is very easy to mistake countenances. Death alters the countenance so very much." "That's true," he said reflectively. "But if the man we've buried is not the Italian, then the mystery is considerably increased. Why was the real man's wife here? And where has her body been concealed? That's the question." "Again a mystery. We have made a thorough search for 4 days without discovering any trace of it. Quite confidentially, I'm wondering if this man Chatter knows anything. It is curious, to say the least, that the Leithcourts should have fled so hurriedly on this man's appearance. But have you actually seen Olinto Santini?" "Yes, and have spoken with him. I sent up to London asking that inquiries should be made at the restaurant in Bayswater, but up to the present I have received no report." "I have chatted with Olinto. His wife has mysteriously disappeared, but he is in ignorance that she is dead." "You did not tell him anything?" "Nothing." "Ah, you did well. There is widespread conspiracy here, depend upon it, Mr. Gregg. It will be an interesting case when we get to the bottom of it all. I only wish this fellow Chatter would tell us the reason he called upon Leithcourt." "What does he say?" "Merely that he has no wish to prosecute, and that he has no statement to make." "Can't you compel him to say something?" I asked. "No, I can't. That's the infernal difficulty of it. If he doesn't choose to speak, then we must still remain in ignorance, although I feel confident that he knows something of the strange affair up in the wood." And although I was silent, I shared the Scotch detective's belief. The afternoon was chill and wet as I climbed the hill to Greenlaw. The sudden disappearance of the tenants of Rannoch was, I found, on everyone's tongue in Dumfries. In the smoke-room of the railway hotel 3 men were discussing it with many grimaces and sinister hints, and the talkative young woman behind the bar asked me my opinion of the strange goings-on up at the castle. As I walked on alone, with the dark line of the woods crowning the hilltop before me, the scene of that double tragedy, I again calmly reviewed the situation. I longed to go to the hospital and see Hylton Chater. Yet when I recollected the part he had played with Hornby on board the Lola, I naturally hesitated. He was allied with Hornby, apparently against Leithcourt, although the latter was Hornby's friend. What, I wondered, had transpired in the library of that gray old castle which stood out boldly before me, dark and grim, as I plodded on through the rain? How had Leithcourt succeeded in rendering his enemy insensible and hiding him in that cupboard? Did he believe that he had killed him? If I went boldly to Chater, then it would only be the betrayal of myself. No, I decided that the man who had smoked and chatted with me so affably on that hot, breathless night in the Mediterranean must remain in ignorance of my presence or of my knowledge. Therefore I stayed for a week at Greenlaw, with eyes and ears ever open, yet exercising care that the patient in the hospital should be unaware of my presence. Mackenzie saw him on several occasions, but he still persisted in that tantalizing silence. The inquiry into the death of the unidentified man in Rannoch Wood had been resumed, and a verdict returned of wilful murder against some person unknown, while of the second crime the public had no knowledge, for the body was not discovered. Time after time I searched the wood alone, on the pretense of shooting pigeon, but discovered nothing. When not having sport on my uncle's property, I joined various parties in the neighborhood, not because Scotland at that time attracted me, but because I desired to watch events. Chater, as soon as he recovered, left the hospital and went south to London, I ascertained, leaving the police utterly in the dark and filled with suspicion of the fugitives from Rannoch. I longed to know the whereabouts of Muriel, hoping to gain from her some information regarding their visitor who had so nearly escaped with his life. That she was aware of the object of his visit was plain from the statements of the servants, all of whom had been left without either money or orders. One day I called at the castle, the front entrance of which I found closed. Gilray, the owner, had come up from London, met his factor there, and discharged all the late tenant's servants, keeping on only 3 of his own who had been in service there for a number of years. Anne Cameron, a housemaid, was one of these, and it was she whom I met when entering by the servants' hall. On questioning her, I found her most willing to describe how she was in the corridor outside the young mistress's room when Mr. Leithcourt dashed along in breathless haste with a telegram in his hand. She heard him cry, "Look at this! Read it, Muriel! We must go! Put on your things at once, my dear! Never mind about luggage! Every minute lost is of consequence!" "What?" he cried a moment later. "You won't go? You'll stay here? Stay here and face them? Good heavens! Girl, are you mad? Don't you know what this means? It means that the secret is out! The secret is out, you hear? We must fly!" The woman told me that she distinctly heard Miss Muriel sobbing while her father walked up and down the room, speaking rapidly in a low tone. Then he came out again and returned to his dressing room, while Miss Muriel presumably changed from her evening gown into a dark traveling dress. "Did he say anything to you?" I inquired. "Only that they were called away suddenly, sir. But," the domestic added, "the young lady was very pale and agitated, and we all knew that something terrible had happened. Mrs. Leithcourt gave orders that nothing was to be told to the guests, who dined alone, believing that their host and hostess had gone down to the village to see an old man who was dying. That was the story we told them, sir." "And in the meantime, the Leithcourts were in the express going to Carlisle?" "Yes, sir. They say in Dumfries that the police telegraphed after them, but they had reached Carlisle and evidently changed there, and so got away." By the administration of a judicious tip, I was allowed to go up to Miss Muriel's room, an elegantly furnished little chamber in the front of the fine old place, with a deep, old-fashioned window commanding a magnificent view across the broad Nithsdale. The room had been tidied up by the maids, but allowed to remain just as she had left it. I advanced to the window, in which was set the large dressing-table, with its big swing mirror and silver-topped bottles, and on gazing out saw, to my surprise, it was the only window which gave a view of that corner of Rannoch Wood where the double tragedy had taken place. Indeed, any person standing at that spot would have a clear view of that one distant window while out of sight of all the rest. A light might be placed there at night, as signal, for instance, or by day a towel might be hung from the window, as though to dry, and yet could be plainly seen at that distance. Another object in the room also attracted my attention, a pair of long field glasses. Had she used these to keep watch upon that spot? I took them up and focused them upon the boundary of the wood, finding that I could distinguish everything quite plainly. "That's where they found the man who was murdered," explained the servant, who still stood in the doorway. "I know," I replied. "I was just trying the glasses." Then I put them down, and on turning saw upon the mantelshelf a small bright red candle shade, which I took in my hand. It was made, I found, to fit upon the electric table lamp. "Miss Muriel was very fond of a red light," explained the young woman, "and as I held it I wondered if that light had ever been placed upon the toilet table and the blind drawn up, whether it had ever been used as a warning of danger." As I expressed a desire to see the young lady's boudoir, the maid Cameron took me down to the luxurious little room where, the first moment I entered, one fact struck me as peculiar. The picture of Elma Heath was no longer there. The photograph had been taken from its frame, and in its place was the portrait of a broad-bowed, full-bearded man in a foreign military uniform, a picture that, being soiled and faded, had evidently been placed there to fill the empty frame. Whose hand had secured that portrait before the Leithcourt's flight? Why, indeed, should I, for the second time, discover the unhappy girl's picture missing? "Has the gentleman who called on the evening of Mr. Leithcourt's disappearance been back here again since he left the hospital?" I inquired, as a sudden idea occurred to me. "Yes, sir. He called here in a fly on the day he came out, and at his request I took him over the castle. He went into the library and spent half an hour in pacing across it, taking measurements and examining the big cupboard in which he was found insensible. It was a very strange affair, sir," added the young woman. "Wasn't it?" "Very," I replied. "The gentleman might have been in there now had I not gone into the library and found a lot of illustrated papers, which I always put in the cupboard to keep the place tidy, thrown out to the floor. I went to put them back, but discovered the door locked. The key I afterwards found in the grate, where Mr. Leithcourt had evidently thrown it, and on opening the door, imagine the shock I had when I found the visitor lying doubled up. I, of course, thought he was dead." "And when he returned here on his recovery, did he question you?" "Oh, yes. He asked about the Leithcourts and especially about Miss Muriel. I believe he's rather sweet on her, by the way he spoke. And really no better or kinder lady never breathed, I'm sure. We're all very sorry indeed for her." "But she had nothing to do with the affair." "Of course not. But she shares in the scandal and disgrace. You should have seen the effect of the news upon the guests when they knew that the Leithcourts had gone. It was a regular pandemonium. They ordered the best champagne out of the cellars and drank it, the men cleared all the cigar boxes, and the women rummaged in their wardrobes until they seemed like a pack of hungry wolves. Everybody went away with their trunks full of the Leithcourts' things. They took whatever they could lay their hands on, and we, the servants, couldn't stop them. I did remonstrate with one lady who was cramming into her trunk 2 of Miss Muriel's best evening dresses, but she told me to mind my own business and leave the room. One man I saw go away with 4 of Mr. Leithcourt's guns, and there was a regular squabble in the billiard room over a set of pearl and emerald dress studs that somebody found in his dressing room. Crane, the valet, says they tossed for them." "Disgraceful!" I ejaculated. "Then as soon as the host and hostess had gone, they simply swept through the rooms and cleared them?" "Yes, sir. They took away all that was most valuable. They'd have had the silver, only Mason had thrown it into the plate chest, all dirty as it was, locked it up, and hid the key. The plate was Mr. Gilray's, you know, sir, and Mason was responsible." "He acted wisely," I said, surprised at the domestic's story. "Why, the guests acted like a gang of thieves." "They were, sir. They rushed all over the house like demons let loose, and they even stole some of our things. I lost the silver chain." "And what did the stranger say when you told him of this?" "He smiled. It did not seem to surprise him in the least, for after all his visit was the cause of the sudden breaking up of the party, wasn't it?" "And did you show him over the whole house?" I inquired. "Yes, sir," responded the servant. "Curiously enough, he had with him what seemed to be a large plan of the castle, and as we went from room to room he compared it with his plan. He was here for hours, and he told me he wanted to make a thorough examination of the place, and didn't want to be disturbed. He also said that he might probably take the place for next season if he liked it. I think, however, he only told me this because he thought I would be more patient while he took his measurements and made his investigations. He was here from 12 till nearly 6 o'clock, and went through every room, even up to the turrets." "He came into this room, I suppose?" "Yes, sir," she responded, with just a slight hesitation, I thought. "This was the room where he stayed the longest. There was a photograph in that frame over there," she added, indicating the frame that had held the picture of Elma Heath, "a portrait of a young lady, which he begged me to give him." "And you gave it to him?" I cried quickly. "Well, yes, sir. He begged so hard for it, saying that it was the portrait of a friend of his." "And he gave you something handsome for it, eh?" The young woman, who I knew could not refuse half a sovereign, colored slightly and smiled. "And who put that picture in its place?" I asked. "I did, sir. I found it upstairs." "He didn't tell you who the young lady was, I suppose?" "No, sir. He only said that that was the only photograph that existed, and that she was dead." "Dead!" I gasped, staring at her. "Yes, sir. That was why he was so anxious for the picture." Elma Heath dead. Could it be true? That sweet pictured face haunted me as no other face had ever impressed itself upon my memory. It somehow seemed to impel me to endeavor to penetrate the mystery, and yet Hylton Chater had declared that she was dead. I recollected the remarkable letter from Abo, and her own declaration that her end was near. That letter was, she said, the last she should write to her friend. Did Hylton Chater actually possess knowledge of the girl's death? Had he all along been acquainted with her whereabouts? What the young woman told me upset all my plans. If Elma Heath were really dead, then she was beyond discovery, and the truth would be hidden forever. "After he had put the photograph in his pocket, the gentleman made a most minute search in this room," the domestic went on. "He consulted his plan, took several measurements, and then tapped on the paneling all along this wall, as though he were searching for some hidden cupboard or hiding place. I looked at the plan and saw a mark in red ink upon it. He was trying to discover that spot, and was greatly disappointed at not being able to do so. He was in here over an hour, and made a most careful search all around." "And what explanation did he give?" "He only said, 'If I find what I want, Anne, I shall make you a present of a £10 note.' That naturally made me anxious." "He made no other remark about the young lady's death?" I inquired anxiously. "No, only he sighed and looked steadily for a long time at the photograph. I saw his lips moving, but his words were inaudible." "You haven't any idea of the reason why he called upon Mr. Leithcourt, I suppose?" "From what he said I've formed my own conclusions," was her answer. "And what is your opinion?" "Well, I feel certain that there is, or was, something concealed in this house that he's very anxious to obtain. He came to demand it of Mr. Leithcourt, but what happened in the library we don't know. He, however, believes that Mr. Leithcourt has not taken it away, and that, whatever it may be, it is still hidden here." End of chapter 9. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 10 of The Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 10. I Show My Hand. On my return to London next day, I made inquiry at the Admiralty and learned that the battleship Bulwark was lying at Palermo. Therefore I telegraphed to Jack Durnford, and late the same afternoon his reply came at the Cecil. Due in London 20th. Dine with me at club that evening. Jack. The 20th! That meant nearly a month of inactivity. In that time I could cross to Abo, make inquiries there, and ascertain perhaps if Elma Heath were actually dead, as Chater had declared. Two facts struck me as remarkable. Baron Oberg was said to be Polish, while the dark-bearded proprietor of the restaurant in Westbourne Grove was also of the same nationality. Then I recollected that pretty little enamelled cross that Mackenzie had found in Rannoch Wood, and it suddenly occurred to me that it might possibly be the miniature of one of the European orders of chivalry. In the club library at midnight I found a copy of Cavalletti's Storia degli Ordini Cavallereschi, the standard work on the subject, and on searching the illustrations I at length discovered a picture of it. It was a Russian order, the coveted Order of St. Anne, bestowed by the Czar only upon persons who have rendered eminent services to the state and to the sovereign. One fact was now certain, namely, that the owner of that tiny cross, the small replica of the fine decoration, must be a person of high official standing. Next day I spent in making inquiries with a view to discovering the house said to be occupied by Leithcourt. As it was not either in the directory or the Blue Book, I concluded that he had perhaps rented it furnished, and after many inquiries and considerable difficulties, I found that such was the fact. He had occupied the house of Lady Heathcote, a few doors from Grosvenor Square, for the precious season, although he had lived there but very little. Where the fugitives were in hiding I had no idea. I longed to meet Muriel again and tell her what I had discovered, yet it was plain that the trio were concealing themselves from Hylton Chater, whom I supposed to be now back in London. The autumn days were dull and rainy, and the streets were muddy and unpleasant, as they always are at the fall of the year. Compelled to remain inactive, I idled in the club with the recollection of that pictured face ever before me, the face of the unfortunate girl who wished her last message to be conveyed to Philip Hornby. What, I wondered, was her secret? What was really her fate? This latter question troubled me until I could bear it no longer. I felt that it was my duty to go to Finland and endeavor to learn something regarding this Baron Oberg and his niece. Frank Hutchinson had written me, declaring that the weather in Leghorn was now perfect, and expressing wonder that I did not return. I was his only English friend, and I knew how dull he was when alone. Even His Majesty's consuls sometimes suffer from homesickness, and long for the smell of the London gutters and a glass of homely bitter ale. But you, my reader, who have lived in a foreign land for any length of time, know well how wearisome becomes the life, however brilliant, and how sweet are the recollections of our dear grey old England with her green fields, her muddy lanes, and the bustling streets of her grey, grimy cities. You have but one home, and England is still your home, even though you may become the most bigoted of cosmopolitans, and may have no opportunity of speaking your native tongue the whole year through. Duty, the duty of a man who had learned such strange facts and knew that a defenseless woman was a victim, called me to Finland. Therefore, with my passport properly viséed, and my papers all in order, I one night left Hull for Stockholm by the weekly Wilson service. 4 days of rough weather in the North Sea and the Baltic brought me to the Swedish capital, whence on the following day I took the small steamer which plies 3 times a week around the Åland Islands and then across the Gulf of Bothnia to Korpo, and through the intricate channels and among those low-lying islands to the grey, lethargic town of Abo. It was not the first occasion on which I had trod Russian soil, and I knew too well the annoyances of the bureaucracy. Finland, however, is perhaps the most severely governed of any of the Czar's dominions, and I had my first taste of its stern, relentless officialdom at the moment of landing on the half-deserted quay. In the wooden passport office the uniformed official, on examining my passport, discovered that at the Russian Consulate-General they had forgotten to date the visé, which had been impressed with a rubber stamp. It was signed by the Consul-General, but the date was missing, whereupon the man shook his head and handed back the document curtly, saying in Russian, which I understood fairly well, although I spoke badly, "This is not in order. It must be returned to London and dated before you can proceed." "But it is not my fault," I protested. "It is the fault of the clerk at the Consulate-General." "You should have examined it before leaving. You must send it to London and return to Stockholm by to-night's boat." "But this is outrageous!" I cried, as he had already taken the papers of a passenger behind me and was looking at them with unconcern. "Enough!" he exclaimed, glaring at me. "You will return to-night, or, if you choose to stay, you will be arrested for landing without a passport." "I shall not go back," I declared defiantly. "Your Consul-General viséed my passport, and I claim under international law to be allowed to proceed without hindrance." "The steamer leaves at 6 o'clock," he remarked without looking up. "If you are in Abo after that, it will be at your own risk." "I am English, recollect," I said. "To me it does not matter what or who you are. Your passport, undated, is worthless." "I shall complain to the Ambassador at Petersburg." "Your ambassador does not interest me in the least. He is not ambassador here in Finland. There is no Czar here." "Oh? Who is ruler in this country, pray?" "His Excellency the Governor General, an official who has love for neither England nor the pigs of English. So recollect that." "Yes," I said meaningly, "I shall recollect it." And I turned and went out of the little wooden office, replacing my passport in my pocketbook. I had already been directed to the hotel and walked there, but as I did so I saw that I was already under the surveillance of the police, for two men in plain clothes who were lounging outside the passport office strolled on after me, evidently to watch my movements. Truly, Finland was under the iron heel of autocracy. After taking my rooms I strolled about the flat, uninteresting town, wondering how best to commence my search. If I had but a photograph to show people, it would give me a great advantage. But I had nothing. I had never, indeed, set eyes upon the unfortunate girl. 6 o'clock came. I heard the steam siren of the departing boat bound for Sweden, but I was determined to remain there at whatever cost. Therefore I returned to the hotel, and at 7 dined comfortably in company with a German who had been my fellow passenger across from Stockholm. At 8 o'clock, however, just as we were idling over dessert, two gray-coated police officers entered and arrested me on the serious charge of landing without a passport. I accompanied them to the police office, where I was ushered into the presence of the big, bristly Russian who held the town of Abo in terror, the chief of police. The officials which Russia sends into Finland are selected for their harsh discipline and hide-bound bureaucracy, and this human machine in uniform was no exception. Had he been the Minister of the Interior himself, he could not have been more self-opinionated. "Well?" he snapped, looking up at me as I was placed before him. "Your name is Gordon Gregg, English, from Stockholm. No passport, and decline to leave, even though warned, eh?" "I have a passport," I said firmly, producing it. He looked at it, and pointing with his finger said, "It has no date, and is therefore worthless." "The fault is not mine, but that of a Russian official. If you wish it to be dated, you may send it to your Consulate-General in London." "I shall not!" he cried, glaring at me angrily. "And for your insult to the law, I shall commit you to prison for 1 month. Perhaps you will then learn Russian manners." "Oh, so you will commit an Englishman to prison for a month, without trial, eh? That's very interesting. Perhaps if you attempt such a thing as that, they may have something to say about it in Petersburg." "You defy me!" "Not in the least. I have presented my passport and demand common courtesy." "Your passport is worthless, I tell you!" he cried. "There, that's how much it is worth to me." And snatching it up, he tore it in half and tossed the pieces of blue paper in my face. My blood was up at this insult, yet I bit my lips and remained quite calm. "Perhaps you will kindly tell me who you are?" I asked in as quiet a voice as I could command. "With pleasure. I am Michael Boranski, Chief of Police of the province of Abo-Biornebourg." "Ah! Well, Michael Boranski, I shall trouble you to pick up my passport, stick it together again, and apologize to me." "Apologize? Me apologize?" And then the fellow laughed aloud, while the police officers on either side of me grinned from ear to ear. "You refuse?" "Refuse? Certainly I do." "Very well, then," I said, reopening my pocketbook and taking out an open letter. "Perhaps you will kindly glance at that. It is in Russian, so you can read it." He snatched it from me with ill grace, but not without curiosity. And then, as he read the lines, his face changed and he went paler. Raising his head, he stood staring at me, open-mouthed in amazement. "I apologize to your Excellency," he gasped, blanched to the lips. "I most humbly apologize. I did not know. You told me nothing." "Perhaps you will kindly mend my passport and give it a proper visé." In an instant he was up from his chair, and having gathered the torn paper from the floor, proceeded to paste it together. On the back he endorsed that it had been torn by accident, and then gave it the proper visé, affixing the stamps. "I trust, Excellency," he said, bowing low as he handed it to me, "I trust that this affair will not trouble you further. I assure you I had no intention of insulting you." "Yes, you had," I said. "You insulted me merely because I am English. But recollect in future that the man who insults an Englishman generally pays for it, and I do not intend to let this pass. There is a higher power in Finland than even the Governor General." "But, Excellency," whined the fellow, who only 10 minutes ago had been such an insulting bully, "I shall lose my position. I have a wife and 6 children. My wife is delicate, and my pay here is not a large one. You will forgive me, won't you, Excellency?" "I have apologized. I most humbly apologize." And he took up the letter I had given him, holding it gingerly with trembling fingers. And well he might, for the document was headed: "Minister of the Imperial Household, Palace of Peterhof." The bearer of this is one Gordon Francis Gregg, British subject, whom it is our will and command that he shall be our guest during his journey through our dominion, and we hereby command all governors of provinces and minor officials to afford him all the facilities he requires and privileges and immunities as our guest. The above decree was in a neat copper plate handwriting in Russian, while beneath was the sprawling signature of the ruler of 130 millions of people, that signature that was all powerful from the Gulf of Bothnia to the Pacific: Nicholas. The document was the one furnished to me a year before when, at the invitation of the Russian government, I had gone on a mission of inquiry into the state of the prisons in order to see, on behalf of the British public, whether things were as black as some writers had painted them. It had been my intention to visit the far-off penal settlements in northern Siberia, but having gone through some 20 prisons in European Russia, my health had failed, and I had been compelled to return to Italy to recuperate. The document had, therefore, remained in my possession because I intended to resume my journey in the following summer. It was in order that I should be permitted to go where I liked, and to see what I liked without official hindrance, that His Majesty the Emperor had, at the instigation of the Ministry of the Interior, given me that most valuable document. Sight of it had changed the Chief of Police from a burly bully into a whining coward, for he saw that he had torn up the passport of a guest of the Czar, and the consequences was most serious if I complained. He begged of me to pardon him, urging all manner of excuses, and humbling himself before me as well as before his 2 inferiors, who now regarded me with awe. "I will atone for the insult in any way your High Excellency desires," declared the official. "I will serve your Excellency in any way he may command." His words suggested a brilliant idea. I had this man in my power. He feared me. "Well," I said after some reluctance, "there is a little matter in which you might be of some assistance. If you will, I will reconsider my decision of complaining to Petersburg." "And what is that, Excellency?" he gasped eagerly. "I desire to know the whereabouts of a young English lady named Elma Heath," I said, and I wrote down the name for him upon a piece of paper. "Age about 20, and was at school at Chichester in England. She is a niece of a certain Baron Oberg." "Baron Oberg?" he repeated, looking at me rather strangely, I thought. "Yes. As she is a foreigner, she will be registered in your books. She is somewhere in your province, but where I do not know. Tell me where she is, and I will say nothing more about my passport," I added. "Then your High Excellency wishes to see the young lady?" he said reflectively, with the paper in his hand. "Yes." "In that case, it is being commanded by the Emperor that I shall serve your Excellency. I will have immediate inquiries made," was his answer. "When I discover her whereabouts, I will do myself the pleasure of calling at your Excellency's hotel." And I left the fellow very satisfied that I had turned his officiousness and hatred of the English to very good account. On that gray, dreary northern coast the long winter was fast settling in. Poor oppressed Finland suffers under a hard climate, with August frosts, an 8 months' winter in the north, and 5 months of frost in the south. Idling in sleepy Abo, where the public buildings were so mean and meagre, and the houses for the most part built of wood, I saw on every hand the disastrous result of the attempted Russification of the country. The hand of the oppressor, that official sent from Petersburg to crush and to conquer, was upon the honest Finnish nation. The Russian bureaucracy was trying to destroy its weaker but more successful neighbor, and in order to do so employed the harshest and most unscrupulous officials it could import. My fellow traveler from Stockholm, who represented a firm of paper makers in Hamburg, and who paid an annual visit to Abo and Helsingfors, acted as my guide around the town, while I awaited the information from the humbled chief of police. My German friend pointed out to me how, since Russia placed her hand upon Finland, progress had been arrested, and certainly plain evidences were on every hand. There was growing discontent everywhere, for many of the newspapers had recently been suppressed, and the remainder were under a severe censorship. Agriculture had already decreased, and many of the cotton spinning and sawmills were silent and deserted. The exploitation of those gigantic forests from which millions of trunks were floated down to the sea annually had now been suspended. The great landowners were deserting the country, and there was silence and depression everywhere. Finland had been separated for economic purposes from the more civilized countries, and bound to the poverty-stricken, artificially isolated and oppressed Russia. The double-headed eagle was everywhere, and the people sat silent and brooding beneath its black shadow. "There will be an uprising here before long," declared the German confidentially, as we were taking tea one day on the wooden balcony of the hotel, where the sea and the low-lying islands stretched out before us in the pale yellow of the autumn sundown. "The people will revolt, as they did in Poland. The Finnish government can only appeal to the Czar through the Governor-General, and one can easily imagine that their suggestions never reach the Emperor. It is said here that the harsher and more corrupt the official, the greater honor does he receive from Petersburg. But trouble is brewing for Russia," he added. "A very serious trouble, depend upon it." I looked upon the gray, dismal scene, the empty port, the silent quay, the dark line of gloomy pine forest away beyond the town, the broken coast and the wide expanse of water glittering in the northern sunset. Yes, the very silence seemed to forebode evil and mystery. Truly what I saw of Finland impressed me even more than what I had witnessed in the far-off eastern provinces of European Russia. My object, however, was not to inquire into the internal condition of Finland, or of her resentment of her powerful conqueror. I was there to find that unfortunate girl who had written so strangely to her old school friend, and whose portrait had, for some hidden reason, been destroyed. On the morning of the third day after my arrival at Abo, while sitting on the hotel veranda reading an old copy of the Paris Journal, many portions of which had been blacked out by the censor, the Chief of Police in his dark green uniform entered and saluted before me. "Your Excellency, may I be permitted to speak with you in private?" "Certainly," I responded, rising and conducting him to my bedroom, where I closed the door, invited him to a seat, and myself sat upon the edge of the bed. "I have made various inquiries," he said, "and I think I have found the lady your Excellency is seeking. My information, however, must be furnished to you in strictest confidence," he added, "because there are reasons why I should withhold her whereabouts from you." "What do you mean?" I inquired. "What reasons?" "Well, the lady is living in Finland in secret." "Then she is alive!" I exclaimed quickly. "I thought she was dead." "To the world she is dead," responded Michael Boranski, stroking his red beard. "For that reason the information I give you must be treated as confidential." "Why should she be in hiding? She is guilty of no offense, is she?" The man shrugged his shoulders, but did not reply. "And this Baron Oberg? You tell me nothing of him," I said with dissatisfaction. "How can I when I know nothing, Excellency?" was his response. I felt certain that the fellow was not speaking the truth, for I had noticed his surprise when I had first uttered the mysterious nobleman's name. "As I have already said, Excellency, I am desirous of atoning for my insult, and will serve you in every manner I can. For that reason I have sought news of the young English lady, the Mademoiselle Heath." "But you have all foreigners registered in your books," I said. "The search was surely not a difficult one. I know your police methods in Russia too well," I laughed. "No, the lady was not registered," he said. "There was a reason." "Why?" "I have told you, Excellency. She is in hiding." "Where?" "I regret that much as I desire, I dare not appear to have any connection with your guest. But I will direct you. Indeed, I will give you instructions to a second person to take you to her." "Is she in Abo?" "No, away in the country. If your Excellency will be down at the end of the quay to-morrow at noon, you will find a carriage in waiting, and the driver will have full instructions how to take you to her, and how to act. Follow his directions implicitly, for he is a man I can trust." "To-morrow!" I cried anxiously. "Why not to-day? I am ready to go at any moment." The Chief of Police remained thoughtful for a few moments, then said: "Well, if I could find the man, you might go to-day. Yet it is a long way, and you would not return before to-morrow." "The roads are safe, I suppose? I don't mind driving in the night." The official glanced at the clock, and rising exclaimed: "Very well, I will send for the man. If we find him, then the carriage will be at the same spot at the eastern end of the quay in 2 hours." "At noon. Very well. I shall keep the appointment." "And after seeing her, you will of course keep your promise of secrecy regarding our little misunderstanding?" he asked anxiously. "I have already given my word," was the response, and the man bowed and left, much, I think, to the surprise of the hotel proprietor and his staff. It was an unusual thing for such a high official as the Chief of Police to visit one of their guests in person. If he desired to interview any of them, he commanded them to attend at his office, or they were escorted there by his gray-coated agents. The day was cold, with a biting wind from the icy north, when after a hasty luncheon I put on my overcoat and strolled along the deserted quay, where I lounged at the further end, watching the approach of a great pontoon of pine logs that had apparently floated out of one of the rivers and was now being navigated to the port by 4 men who seemed every moment in imminent danger of being washed off the raft into the sea as the waves broke over and drenched them. They had, however, lashed themselves to their raft, I saw, and now slowly piloted the great floating platform towards the quay. I think I must have waited half an hour, when my attention was suddenly attracted by the rattle of wheels over the stones, and turning I saw an old closed carriage drawn by 3 horses abreast, with bells upon the harness, approaching me rapidly. When it drew up, the driver, a burly-looking fair-headed Finn in a huge sheepskin overcoat, motioned me to enter, urging in broken Russian, "Quickly, Excellency, quickly! You must not be seen!" And then the instant I was seated, and before I could close the door, the horses plunged forward and we were tearing at full gallop out of the town. For 5 miles or so we skirted the sea along a level, well-made road through a barren, wind-swept country, whence the meager harvest had already been garnered. There were no villages. All around was a houseless land, rolling miles of brown and green, broken and checkered by bits of forest and clumps of dark, melancholy pines. The road ran ever and anon right down to where the cold green waves broke upon the rocky shore. In a few weeks that coast would be ice-bound and snow-covered, and then the silence of the God-forsaken country would be complete. After 5 miles or so the driver pulled up and descended to readjust his harness, whereupon I got out and asked him in the best Russian I could command, "Where are we going?" "To Nystad." "How far is that?" 68, was his reply. I took him to imply kilometers, as being a Finn he would not speak of versts. "The Chief of Police has given you directions?" I asked. "His Excellency has told me exactly what to do," was the man's answer, as he took out his huge wooden pipe and filled it. "You wish to see the young lady?" "Yes," I answered, "to first see her, and I do not know whether it will be necessary for me to make myself known to her." "Where is she?" "Beyond Nystad," was his vague answer, with a wave of his big fat hand in the direction of the dark pine forest that stretched before us. "We shall be there about an hour after sundown." Then I re-entered that stuffy old conveyance that rocked and rolled as we dashed away over the uneven forest road, and sat wondering to what manner of place I was being conducted. Elma Heath was in hiding. Why? I recollected her curious letter and remembered every word of it. She wished Hornby to know that she had never revealed her secret. What secret, I wondered? I lit an abominable cigar and tried to smoke, but I was too filled with anxiety, too bewildered by the maze of mystery in which I now found myself. 2 hours later we pulled up before a long, log-built post-house, just beyond a small town in a hollow that faced the sea, and I alighted to watch the steaming horses being replaced by a trio of fresh ones. The place was Doddydal, I was informed, and the proprietor of the place, when I entered and tossed off a liqueur glass of cognac, pointed out to me a row of granite buildings fallen much to decay as the ancient convent. Then, resuming our journey, the short day quickly drew to a close, the sun sank yellow and watery over the towering pines through which we went mile after mile, a dense interminable forest wherein the wolves lurked in winter, often rendering the road dangerous. The temperature fell, and it froze again. Through the window in the front I could see the big Finn driver throwing his arms across his shoulders to promote circulation, in the same manner as does the London cabby. When night drew on we changed horses again at a small dirty post-house in the forest at the edge of a lake, and then pushed forward again, although it was already long past the hour at which he had said we should arrive. Time passed slowly in the darkness, for we had no light, and the horses seemed to find their way by instinct. The rolling of the lumbering old vehicle after 6 hours had rendered me sleepy, I think, for I recollect closing my eyes and conjuring up that strange scene on board the Lola. Indeed, I suppose I must have slept, for I was awakened by a light shining into my face and the driver shaking me by the shoulder. When I roused myself and naturally inquired the reason, he placed his finger mysteriously upon my lips, saying, "Hush, your high nobility, hush! Come with me, but make no noise. If we are discovered, it means death for us, death. Come, give me your hand, slowly, tread softly. See, here is the boat. I will get in first. We shall not be heard upon the water. So." And the fellow led me, half dazed, down to the bank of a broad, dark river which I could just distinguish. He led me to an unknown bourne. End of chapter 10. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 11 of The Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 11. The Castle of the Terror. Part 1. The big Finn had, I found, tied up his horses, and in the heavy old boat he rowed me down the swollen river which ran swift and turbulent around a bend, and then seemed to open out to a great width. In the starlight I could distinguish that it stretched gray and level to a distance, and that the opposite bank was fringed with pines. "Where are we going?" I asked my guide in a low voice, but he only whispered, "Hush, Excellency. Remain patient, and you shall see the young Englishwoman." So I sat in the boat while he allowed it to drift with the current, steering it with the great heavy oars. The river suddenly narrowed again, with high pines on either bank, a silent, lonesome reach, perhaps indeed one of the loneliest spots in all Europe. Once the dismal howl of a wolf sounded close to where we passed, but my guide made no remark. After nearly a mile the stream again opened out into a broad lake where, in the distance, I saw rising sheer and high from the water a long square building of 3 stories, with a tall round tower at one corner. An old medieval castle it seemed to be. From one of the small windows of the tower, as we came into view of it, a light was shining upon the water, and my guide, seeing it, grunted in satisfaction. It had undoubtedly been placed there as signal. With great caution he approached the place, keeping in the deep shadow of the bank until we came exactly opposite the flanking tower. In the lighted window I distinctly saw a dark figure of someone appear for a moment, and then my guide struck a match and held it in his fingers until it was wholly consumed. Almost instantly the light was extinguished, and then, after waiting 5 minutes or so, he pulled straight across the lake to the high, dark tower that descended into the water. The place was as grim and silent as any I had ever seen, an impregnable stronghold of the days before siege guns were invented, the fortress of some feudal prince or count who had probably held the surrounding country in thraldom. I put my hand against the black slimy wall to prevent the boat bumping, and then distinguished just beyond me a small wooden ledge and half a dozen steps which led up to a low arched door. The latter had opened noiselessly, and the dark figure of a woman stood peering forth. My guide uttered some reassuring word in Finnish in a low half whisper, then slowly pushed the boat along the edge, saying, "Your high nobility may disembark. There is at present no danger." I rose, gripped a big rusty chain to steady myself, and climbed into the narrow doorway in the ponderous wall, where I found myself in the darkness beside the female who had apparently been expecting our arrival and watching our signal. Without a word she led me through a short passage, and then, striking a match, lit a big old-fashioned lantern. As the light fell upon her features, I saw they were thin and hard, with deep-set eyes and a stray wisp of silver across her wrinkled brow. Around her head was a kind of hood of the same stuff as her dress, a black coarse woolen, while around her neck was a broad linen collar. In an instant I recognized that she was a member of some religious order, some minor order perhaps, with whose habit we in Italy were not acquainted. The thin ascetic countenance was that of a woman of strong character, and her funereal habits seemed much too large for her stunted, shrunken figure. "The sister speaks French?" I hazarded in that language, knowing that in most convents throughout Europe French is known. "Oui, monsieur," was her answer. "And a little English, too, a very little," she smiled. "You know why I am here?" I said, gratified that at least one person in that lonesome country could speak my own tongue. "Yes, I have already been told," was her answer with a strong accent as we stood in that small, bare stone room, a semicircular chamber in the tower, once perhaps a prison. "But are you not afraid to venture here?" she asked. "Why?" "Well, because no strangers are permitted here, you know. If your presence here was discovered, you would not leave this place alive. So I warn you." "I am prepared to risk that," I said, smiling. At the same time my hand instinctively sought my hip pocket to ascertain that my weapon was safe. "I wish to see Miss Elma Heath." The old nun nodded, fumbling with her lantern. I glanced at my watch and found that it was already 2 o'clock in the morning. "Remember that if you are discovered here, you exonerate me of all blame," she said, raising her head and peering into my face with her keen gray eyes. "By admitting you I am betraying my trust, and that I should not have done were it not compulsory." "Compulsory? How?" "The order of the Chief of Police. Even here we cannot afford to offend him." So the fellow Boranski had really kept faith with me, and at his order the closed door of the convent had been opened. "Of course not," I answered. "Russian officialdom is all powerful in Finland nowadays. But where is the lady?" "You are still prepared to risk your liberty and life?" she asked in a hoarse voice, full of grim meaning. "I am," I said. "Lead me to her." "And when you see her, you will make no effort to speak with her? Promise me that." "Ah, sister!" I cried. "You are asking too great a sacrifice of me. I come here from England, nay, from Italy, in search of her, to question her regarding a strange mystery, and to learn the truth. Surely I may be permitted to speak with her?" "You wish to learn the truth, sir?" remarked the woman. "I thought you were her lover, that you merely wished to see her once again." "No, I am not her lover," I answered. "Indeed, we have never yet met. But I am in search of the truth from her own lips." "That you will never learn," she said in a hard, changed voice. "Because there is a conspiracy to preserve the secret," I cried. "But I intend to solve the mystery, and for that reason I have traveled here from England." The woman with the lantern smiled sadly, as though amused by my impetuosity. "You are on Russian soil now, monsieur, not English," she remarked in her broken English. "If your object were known, you would never be spared to return to your own land." "Ah!" she sighed. "You do not know the mysteries and terrors of Finland. I am a French subject, born in Tours, and brought to Helsingfors when I was 15. I have been in Finland 45 years. Once we were happy here, but since the Czar appointed Baron Oberg to be Governor-General," and she shrugged her shoulders without finishing her sentence. "Baron Oberg, Governor-General of Finland!" I gasped. "Certainly. Did you not know?" she said, dropping into French. "It is 4 years now that he has held supreme power, to crush and Russify these poor Finns. Ah, monsieur, this country, once so prosperous, is a blot upon the face of Europe. His methods are the worst and most unscrupulous of any employed by Russia. Before he came here he was the best hated man in Petersburg, and that, they say, is why the Emperor sent him to us." "And he is uncle of this young lady, Elma Heath?" "Uncle? Ah, I don't know that, monsieur. I have never been told so. His niece, poor young lady. Can that be? Surely not." "Why not?" I asked. But the woman gave me no reason. She only exhibited her palms and sighed. She seemed to have compassion upon the girl I sought. Her heart was really softer than I had believed it to be. "Where does this Baron live?" I asked, surprised that he should occupy so high a place in Russian officialdom, the representative of the Czar, with powers as great as the Emperor himself. "At the Government Palace in Helsingfors." "And Elma Heath is here, in this grim fortress. Why?" "Ah, monsieur, how can I tell? By reason of family secrets, perhaps. They account for so much, you know." "That is exactly my opinion," I said. "She has been brought here against her will." "Most probably. This is not a cheerful place, as you see. We have 5 months of ice and snow, and for 4 months are practically cut off from civilization and see no new face." "Terrible!" I gasped, glancing round at those dark stone walls that seemed to breathe an air of tragedy and mystery. The old castle had, I supposed, been turned into a convent, as many have been in Germany and Austria. Back in feudal times it no doubt had been a grand old place." "And have you been here long?" I asked. "7 years only. But I am leaving. Even I, used as I am to a solitary life, can stand it no longer. I feel that its cold silence and dreariness will drive me mad. In winter the place is like an ice well." The fact that the Baron was ruler of Finland amazed me, for I had half expected him to be some clever adventurer. Yet as the events of the past flashed through my brain, I recollected that in Rannoch Wood had been found the miniature of the Russian Order of St. Anne, a distinction which, in all probability, had been conferred upon him. If so, the coincidence, to say the least, was a remarkable one. I questioned my companion further regarding the Baron. "Ah, monsieur," she declared, "they call him the Strangler of the Finns. It was he who ordered the peasants of Kasko to be flogged until 4 of them died, and the Czar gave him the Star of White Eagle for it. He who suppressed half the newspapers, and put 18 editors in prison for publishing a report of a meeting of the Swedes in Helsingfors. He who encourages corruption and bribery among the officials for the furtherance of Russian interests. He who has ordered Russian to be the official language, who has restricted public education, who has overtaxed and ground down the people until now the mine is laid, and Finland is ready for open revolt. The prisons are filled with the innocent, women are flogged, the poor are starving, and the Strangler, as they call him, reports to the Czar that Finland is submissive and is Russianized." I had heard something of this abominable state of affairs from time to time from the English press, but had never taken notice of the name of the oppressor. So the uncle of Elma Heath was the Strangler of Finland, the man who, in 4 years, had reduced a prosperous country to a state of ruin and revolt. "Can I not see her?" I asked, feeling that we had remained too long there. If my presence in that place was perilous, the sooner I escaped from it the better. "Yes, come," she said. "But silence. Walk softly." And holding up the old horn lantern to give me light, she led me out into the low stone corridor again, conducting me through a number of intricate passages, all bare and gloomy, the stones worn hollow by the feet of ages. On we crept noiselessly, past a number of low arched doors studded with big nails in the style of generations ago. Then, turning suddenly at right angles, I saw that we were in a kind of cul-de-sac, before the door of which at the end she stopped and placed her finger upon her lips. Then, motioning me to remain here, she entered, closing the door after her and leaving me in the pitch darkness. I strained my ears, but could hear no sound save that of someone moving within. No word was uttered, or if so, it was whispered so low that it did not reach me. For nearly 5 minutes I waited in impatience outside that closed door, until again the handle turned, and my conductress beckoned me in silence within. I stepped into a small square chamber, the floor of which was carpeted, and where, suspended high above, was a lamp that shed but a faint light over the barely furnished place. It seemed to me to be a kind of sitting-room, with a plain deal table and a couple of chairs, but there was no stove, and the place looked chill and comfortless. Beyond was another smaller room into which the old nun disappeared for a moment. Then she came forth, leading a strange, wan little figure in a gray gown, a figure whose face was the most perfect and most lovely I had ever seen. Her wealth of chestnut hair fell dishevelled about her shoulders, and as her hands were clasped before her, she looked straight at me in surprise as she was led towards me. She walked but feebly, and her countenance was deathly pale. Her dress, as she came beneath the lamp, was, I saw, coarse yet clean, and her beautiful regular features, which in her photograph had held me in such fascination, were even more sweet and more matchless than I had believed them to be. I stood before her dumbfounded in admiration. In silence she bowed gracefully, and then looked at me with astonishment, apparently wondering what I, a perfect stranger, required of her. "Miss Elma Heath, I presume," I exclaimed at last. "May I introduce myself to you? My name is Gordon Gregg, English by birth, cosmopolitan by instinct. I have come here to ask you a question that concerns yourself. Lydia Moreton has sent me to you." I noticed that her great brown eyes watched my lips and not my face. Her own lips moved, but she looked at me with an inexpressible sadness. No sound escaped her. I stood rigid before her as one turned to stone, for in that instant, in a flash indeed, I realized the awful truth. She was both deaf and dumb. She raised her clasped hands to me in silence, yet with tears welling in her splendid eyes. I saw that upon her wrist were a pair of bright steel gyves. "What is this place?" I demanded of the woman in the religious habit, when I recovered from the shock of the poor girl's terrible affliction. "Where am I?" "This is the castle of Kajana, the criminal lunatic asylum of Finland," was her answer. "The prisoner, as you see, has lost both speech and hearing." "Deaf and dumb!" I cried, looking at the beautiful original of that destroyed photograph on board the Lola. "But she has surely not always been so!" I exclaimed. "No, I think not always," replied the sister quietly. "But you said you intended to question her. And did I not tell you that to learn the truth was impossible?" "But she can write responses to my questions," I argued. "Alas, no," was the old woman's whispered reply. "Her mind is affected. She is unfortunately a hopeless lunatic." I looked straight into those sad, wide open, yet unflinching brown eyes, utterly confounded. Those white wrists held in steel, that pale face and blanched lips, the inertness of her movements, all told their own tragic tale. And yet that letter I had read, dictated in secret most probably because her hands were not free, was certainly not the outpourings of a madwoman. She had spoken of death, it was true, yet was it not to be supposed that she was slowly being driven to suicide? She had kept her secret, and she wished the man Hornby, the man who was to marry Muriel Leithcourt, to know. The room in which we stood was evidently an apartment set apart for her use, for beyond was the tiny bedchamber. Yet the small high-up window was closely barred, and the cold bareness of the prison was sufficient indeed to cause anyone confined there to prefer death to captivity. Again I spoke to her slowly and kindly, but there was no response. That she was absolutely dumb was only too apparent. Yet surely she had not always been so. I had gone in search of her because the beauty of her portrait had magnetized me, and I had now found her to be even more lovely than her picture, yet alas, suffering from an affliction that rendered her life a tragedy. The realization of the terrible truth staggered me. Such a perfect face as hers I had never before set eyes upon, so beautiful, so clear-cut, so refined, so eminently the countenance of one well born, and yet so ineffably sad, so full of blank, unutterable despair. She placed her clasped hands to her mouth, and made signs by shaking her head that she could neither understand nor respond. I therefore took my wallet from my pocket, and wrote upon a piece of paper in a large hand the words, "I come from Lydia Moreton. My name is Gordon Gregg." When her eager gaze fell upon the words she became instantly filled with excitement and nodded quickly. Then, holding her steel-clamped wrists towards me, she looked wistfully at me, as though imploring me to release her from the awful bondage in that silent tomb. Though the woman who had led me there endeavored to prevent it, I handed her the pencil, and placed the paper on the table for her to write. The nun tried to snatch it up, but I held her arm gently and forcibly, saying in French, "No, I wish to see if she is really insane. You will at least allow me this satisfaction." And while we were in altercation, Elma, with the pencil in her fingers, tried to write, but by reason of her hands being bound so closely was unable. At length, however, after several attempts, she succeeded in printing in uneven capitals the response, "I know you. You were on the yacht. I thought they killed you." The thin-faced old woman saw her response, a reply that was surely rational enough, and her brows contracted with displeasure. "Why are you here?" I wrote, not allowing the Sister to get sight of my question. In response she wrote painfully and laboriously: "I am condemned for a crime I did not commit. Take me from here, or I shall kill myself." "Ah!" exclaimed the old woman. "You see, poor girl, she believes herself innocent. They all do." "But why is she here?" I demanded fiercely. "I do not know, monsieur. It is not my duty to inquire the history of their crimes. When they are ill, I nurse them. That is all." "And who is the commandant of this fortress?" "Colonel Smirnoff. If he knew that I had admitted you, you would never leave this place alive. This is the Schusselburg of Finland, the place of imprisonment for those who have conspired against the state." "The prison of political conspirators, eh?" "Alas, monsieur, yes. The place in which some of the poor creatures are tortured in order to obtain confessions and information with as much cruelty as in the black days of the Inquisition. These walls are thick, and their cries are not heard from the oubliettes below the lake." I had long ago heard of the horrors of Schusselburg. Indeed, who has not heard of them who has traveled in Russia? The very mention of the modern Bastille on Lake Ladoga, where no prisoner has ever been known to come forth alive, is sufficient to cause any Russian to turn pale. And I was in the Schusselburg of Finland. I turned over the sheet of paper and wrote the question: "Did Baron Oberg send you here?" In response she printed the words: "I believe so. I was arrested in Helsingfors. Tell Lydia where I am." "Do you know Muriel Leithcourt?" I inquired by the same means, whereupon she replied that they were at school together. "Did you see me on board the Lola?" I wrote. "Yes, but I could not warn you, although I had overheard their intentions. They took me ashore when you had gone to Siena. After 3 days I found myself deaf and mute. I was made so." Her allegation startled me. She had been purposely afflicted. "Who did it?" "A doctor, I suppose. They put me under chloroform." "Who?" "People who said they were my friends." I turned to the woman in the religious habit and cried: "Do you see what she has written? She has been maimed by some friend who intended that the secret she holds should be kept. They feared to kill her, so they bribed a doctor to deliberately operate upon her so that she could neither speak nor hear. And now they are driving her to suicide." "Monsieur, I am astounded," declared the nun. "I have always believed that she was not in her right mind. Yet assuredly she seems to be as sane as I am, only wilfully mutilated by some pretended friend who determined that no further word should pass her lips." "A shameful mutilation has been committed upon this poor defenseless girl," I cried in anger, "and I will make it my duty to discover and punish the perpetrators of it." "Ah, monsieur, do not act rashly, I pray of you," the woman said seriously, placing her hand upon my arm. "Recollect, you are in Finland, where the Baron Oberg is all powerful." "I do not fear the Baron Oberg," I exclaimed. "If necessary I will appeal to the Czar himself. Mademoiselle is kept here for the reason that she is in possession of some secret. She must be released. I will take the responsibility." "But you must not try to release her from here. It would mean death to you both. The castle of Kajana tells no secrets of those who die within its walls, or of those cast headlong into its waters and forgotten." Again I turned to Elma, who stood in anxious wonder of the subject of our conversation, and had suddenly taken the old nun's hand and kissed it affectionately, perhaps in order to show me that she had trusted her. Then upon the paper I wrote: "Is the Baron Oberg your uncle?" She shook her head in the negative, showing that the dreaded Governor-General of Finland had only acted a part towards her in which she had been compelled to concur. "Who is Philip Hornby?" I inquired, writing rapidly. "My friend. At least, I believe so. Friend. And I had all along believed him to be an adventurer and an enemy." "Why did he go to Leghorn?" I asked. "For a secret purpose. There was a plot to kill you, only I managed to thwart them," were the words she printed with much labor. "Then I owe my life to you," I wrote, "and in return I will do my utmost to rescue you from here, if you do not fear to place yourself in my hands." And to this she replied, "I shall be thankful, for I cannot bear this awful place longer. I believe they must torture the women here. They will torture me some day. Do your best to get me out of here, and I will tell you everything. But," she wrote, "I fear you can never secure my release. I am confined here on a life sentence." "But you are English, and if you have had no trial I can complain to our ambassador." "No, I am a Russian subject. I was born in Russia, and went to England when I was a girl." That altered the case entirely. As a subject of the Czar in her own country, she was amenable to that disgraceful blot upon civilization that allows a person to be consigned to prison at the will of a high official, without trial, and without being afforded any opportunity of appeal. I therefore at once saw a difficulty. Yet she promised to tell me the truth if I could but secure her release. A flood of recollections of the amazing mystery swept through my mind. 1,000 questions arose within me, all of which I desired to ask her. But there, in that noisome prison-house, it was impossible. As I stood there, a woman's shrill scream of excruciating pain reached me, notwithstanding those cyclopean walls. Some unfortunate prisoner was, perhaps, being tortured, and confession wrung from her lips. I shuddered at the unspeakable horrors of that grim fortress. Could I allow this refined, defenseless girl to remain an inmate of that Bastille, the terrors of which I had heard men in Russia hint at with bated breath? They had willfully maimed her and deprived her of both hearing and the power of speech, and now they intended that she should be driven mad by that silence and loneliness that must always end in insanity. "I have decided," I said suddenly, turning to the woman who had conducted me there, and having now removed the steel bonds of the prisoner with a key she secretly carried, stood with folded hands in the calm attitude of the religious. "You will not act with rashness?" she implored in quick apprehension. "Remember, your life is at stake as well as my own." "Her enemies intended that I too should die," I answered, looking straight into those deep, mysterious brown eyes which held me as beneath a spell. "They have drawn her into their power because she had no means of defense. But I will assume the position of her friend and protector." "How?" "The man is awaiting me in the boat outside. I intend to take her with me." "But, monsieur, why that is impossible!" cried the old woman in a hoarse voice. "If you were discovered by the guards who patrol the lake both night and day, they would shoot you both." "I will risk it," I said, and without another word dashed into the tiny bedchamber and tore an old brown blanket from off the narrow truckle bed. Then, linking my arm in that of the woman whose lovely countenance had verily become the sun of my existence, I made a sign, inviting her to accompany me. The sister barred the door, urging me to reconsider my decision. "Leave her alone in secret, and act as you will, appeal to the Baron, to the Czar, but do not attempt, monsieur, to rescue a prisoner from here, for it is an impossibility. The man who brought you here from Abo will not dare to accept such responsibility." "Come," I said to Elma, although at last she could not hear my voice. "Let us at least make a dash for freedom." She recognized my intentions in a moment, and allowed herself to be conducted down the long, intricate corridor, walking stealthily and making no noise. I had seized the old horn lantern, and as the nun held back, not daring to accompany us, we stole on alone, turning back along the stone corridor, until I recognized the door of the room to which I had been first conducted. All was silent, and as we crept along on tiptoe, I felt the girl's grip upon my arm, a grip that told me that she placed her faith in me as her deliverer. I own that it was a rash and headstrong act, for even beyond the lake how could we ever hope to penetrate those interminable, inhospitable forests, so far from any hiding place? Yet I felt it my duty to attempt the rescue. And besides, had not her marvelous beauty enmeshed me? Had I not felt by some unaccountable intuition at the first moment we had met that our lives were linked in the future? She clung to me as though fearful of discovery, as we went forward in silence along that dark, low corridor where I knew the strong door in the tower opened upon the lake. Once in the boat, we could row back to where the horses awaited us, and then away. The woman had not arrested our progress or raised an alarm, after all. Once I had mistrusted her, but I now saw that her heart was really filled with pity for the poor girl now at my side. Without a sound we crept forward until within a few yards from that unlocked door where the boat awaited us below, when all of a sudden the uncertain light of a lantern fell upon something that shone, and a deep voice cried out of the darkness in Russian, "Halt, or I fire!" And startled, we found ourselves looking down the muzzle of a loaded carbine. This is the end of Chapter 11, Part 1. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 11 of The Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 11. The Castle of Terror. Part 2. A huge sentry stood with his back to the secret exit, his dark eyes shining beneath his peaked cap as he held his weapon to his shoulder, within 6 feet of us. The big bearded fellow demanded fiercely who I was. My heart sank within me. I had acted recklessly, and had fallen into the hands of His Excellency, the Baron Xavier Oberg, the unscrupulous Governor-General, fallen into a trap which, it seemed, had been very cleverly prepared for me. I was a prisoner in the terrible fortress whence no single person save the guards had ever been known to emerge, the Bastille of the Strangler of Finland. I saw I was lost. The muzzle of the sentry's carbine was within 2 feet of my chest. "Speak!" cried the fellow. "Who are you?" At a glance I took in the peril of the situation, and without a second's hesitation made a dive for the man beneath his weapon. He lowered it, but it was too late, for I gripped him around the waist, rendering his gun useless. It was the work of an instant, for I knew that to close with him was my only chance. Yet if the boat was not in waiting below that closed door, if my Finn driver was not there in readiness, then I was lost. The unfortunate girl whom I was there to rescue drew back in fright against the wall for a single second. Then, seeing that I had closed with the hulking fellow, she sprang forward and with both hands seized the gun and attempted to wrest it from him. His fingers had lost the trigger, and he was trying to regain it to fire and so raise the alarm. I saw this, and with an old trick learned at Uppingham I tripped him, so that he staggered and nearly fell. An oath escaped him, yet in that moment Elma succeeded in twisting the gun from his sinewy hands, which I now held with the strength begotten of my imminent peril. My whole future, as well as hers, depended upon my success in that desperate encounter. He was huge and powerful, with a strength far exceeding my own. Yet I had been reckoned a good wrestler at Uppingham, and now my knowledge of that most ancient form of combat held me in good stead. The man shouted for help, his deep, hoarse voice sounding along the stone corridors. If heard by his comrade in arms, then the alarm would at once be given. We struggled desperately, swaying to and fro, he trying to throw me, while I, at every turn, practiced upon him the tricks learned in my youth. It seemed an even match, however, for he kept his feet by sheer brute force, and his muscles seemed hard and unbending as steel. Suddenly, however, as we were striving so vigorously and desperately, the English girl slipped past us with the carbine in her hand, and with a quick movement dragged open the heavy door that gave exit to the lake. At that instant I unfortunately made a false move, and his hand closed upon my throat like a band of steel. I fought and struggled to loose myself, exerting every muscle, but at last he gained the advantage. I heard a splash, and saw that Elma no longer held the sentry's weapon in her hands, having thrown it into the water. Then, at the same moment, I heard a voice outside cry in a low tone, "Courage, Excellency! Courage! I will come and help you!" It was the faithful Finn who had been awaiting me in the deep shadow, and with a few strokes pulled his boat up to the narrow rickety ledge outside the door. "Take the lady," I succeeded in gasping in Russian. "Never mind me." And I saw to my satisfaction that he guided Elma to step into the boat, which at that moment drifted past the little platform. I struggled valiantly, but against such a man of brute strength I was powerless. He held my throat, causing me excruciating pain, and each moment I felt my chance of victory grow smaller. My strength was failing. While I held his arms at his sides, I could keep him secure without much effort, but now with his fingers pressing in my windpipe, I could not breathe. I was slowly being strangled. To be vanquished meant imprisonment there, perhaps even death. Victory meant Elma's life as well as my own. Mine was therefore a fight for life. A sudden idea flashed across my mind, and I continued to struggle, at the same time gradually forcing my enemy backward towards the door. He shouted for help, but was unheard. He cursed and swore and shouted until, with a sudden and almost superhuman effort, I tripped him, bringing his head into such violent contact with the stone lintel of the door that the sound could surely be heard a considerable distance. For a moment he was stunned, and in that brief second I released his grip from my throat and hurled him backwards beyond the door. There was a sound of the crashing of wood as the rotten platform gave way, a loud splash, and next instant the dark waters closed over the big bearded fellow who would have snatched Elma Heath from me and have held me prisoner in that castle of terrors. He sank like a stone, for although I stood watching for him to rise, I could only distinguish the woodwork floating away with the current. In a moment, however, even as I stood there in horror at my deed of self-defense, the place suddenly resounded with shouts of alarm, and in the tower above me the great old rusty bell began to swing, ringing its brazen note across the broad expanse of waters. The fair-bearded Finn again shot the boat across to where I stood, crying, "Jump, Excellency! For your life, jump! The guards will be upon us!" Behind me in the passage I saw a light and the glitter of arms. A shot rang out and a bullet whizzed past me, but I stood unharmed. Then I jumped and nearly upset the boat, but taking an oar I began to row for life, and as we drew away from those grim black walls the fire belched forth from 3 rifles. "Row!" I shrieked, turning to see if my fair companion had been hit. "Keep cool, Excellency," urged the Finn. "See, right away there in the shadow. We might trick them, for the patrol boat will be at the head of the river waiting to cut us off." Again the guards fired upon us, but in the darkness their aim was faulty. Lights appeared in the high windows of the castle, and we could see that the greatest commotion had been caused by the escape of the prisoner. The men at the door in the tower were shouting to the patrol boats, which were nowhere to be seen, calling them to row us down and capture us, but by plying our oars rapidly we shot straight across the lake until we got under the deep shadow of the opposite shore, and then crept gradually along in the direction we had come. "If we meet the boats, Excellency, we must run ashore and take to the woods," explained the Finn. "It is our only chance." Scarcely had he spoken when out in the center of the lake we could just distinguish a long-boat with 3 rowers going swiftly towards the entrance to the river, which we so desired to gain. "Look!" cried our guide, backing water and bringing the boat to a standstill. "They are in search of us. If we are discovered they will fire. It is their orders. No boat is allowed upon this lake." Elma sat watching our pursuers, but still calm and silent. She seemed to entrust herself entirely to me. The guards were rowing rapidly, the oars sounding in the rowlocks, evidently in the belief that we had made for the river. But the Finlander had apparently foreseen this, and for that reason we were lying safe from observation in the deep shadow of an overhanging tree. A gray mist was slowly rising from the river, and the Finn, noticing it, hoped that it might favor us. In Finland, in late autumn, the mists are often as thick as our proverbial London fogs, only whiter, denser, and more frosty. "If we disembark we shall be compelled to make a detour of fully 4 days in the forest in order to pass the marshes," he pointed out in a low whisper. "But if we can enter the river we can go ashore anywhere and get by foot to some place where the lady can lie in hiding. What do you advise? We are entirely in your hands. The chief of police told me he could trust you. "I think it will be best to risk it," he said in Russian after a brief pause. "We will tie up the boat, and I will go along the bank and see what the guards are doing. You will remain here, and I shall not be seen. The rushes and undergrowth are higher further along. But if there is danger while I am absent, get out and go straight westward until you find the marsh. Then keep along its banks due south." And drawing up the boat to the bank, the shrewd, big-boned fellow disappeared into the dark undergrowth. There were no signs yet of the break of day. Indeed, the stars were now hidden, and the great plain of water was every moment growing more indistinct as we both sat in silence. My ears were strained to catch the dipping of an oar or a voice, but beyond the lapping of the water beneath the boat there was no other sound. I took the hand of the fair-faced girl at my side and pressed it. In return she pressed mine. It was the only means by which we could exchange confidences. She whom I had sought through all those months sat at my side, yet powerless to utter one single word. Still holding her hands in both my own, I gripped them to show her that I intended to be her champion, while she turned to me in confidence, as though happy that it should be so. What, I wondered, was her history? What was the mystery surrounding her? What could be that secret which had caused her enemies to thus brutally maim and mutilate her, and afterwards send her to that grim, terrible fortress that still loomed up before us in the gloom? Surely her secret must affect some person very seriously, or such drastic means would never be employed to secure her silence. Suddenly I heard a stealthy footstep approaching, and next moment a low voice which I recognized as that of our friend the Finn. "There is danger, Excellency, a grave danger," he said in a low half-whisper. "3 boats are in search of us." And scarcely had he uttered those words when there was a flash of a rifle from the haze, a loud report, and again a bullet whizzed past just behind my head. In an instant the truth became apparent, for I saw the dark shadow of a boat rapidly rowed, bearing full upon us. The shot had been fired as a signal that we had been sighted and were pursued. Other shots rang out, mingled with the wild exultant shouts of the guards as they bore down full upon us, and then I knew that, notwithstanding our escape, we were now lost. They were too close upon us to admit of eluding them. The peril we had dreaded had fallen. The Finn's presence on the shore had evidently been detected by a boat drawn up at the shore, and he had been followed to where we had lain in what we had so foolishly believed to be a safe hiding-place. Naught else was to be done but to face the inevitable. 3 times the red fire of a rifle belched angrily in our faces, and yet by good fortune neither of us was struck. Yet we knew too well that the intention of our pursuers was to kill us. "Quick, Excellency, fly, while there is yet time!" gasped the Finn, grasping my hand and half dragging me from the boat, while I, in turn, placed Elma on the bank. "Hayda! This way! Swiftly!" cried our guide, and the 3 of us, heedless of the consequences, plunged forward into the impenetrable darkness, just as our fierce pursuers came alongside where we had only a moment ago been seated. They shouted wildly as they sprang to land after us, but our guide, who had been born and bred in these forests, knew well how to travel in a semicircle, and how to conceal himself. It was a race for freedom, nay, for very life. So dark that we could see before us hardly a foot, we were compelled to place our hands in front of us to avoid collision with the big tree trunks, while ever and anon we found ourselves entangled in the mass of dead creepers and vegetable parasites that formed the dense undergrowth. Around us on every side we heard the shouts and curses of our pursuers, while above the rest we heard an authoritative voice, evidently that of a sergeant of the guard, cry, "Shoot the man, but spare the woman. The colonel wants her back. Don't let her escape. We shall be well rewarded. So keep on, comrades. Many Edemski." But the trembling girl beside me heard nothing, and perhaps indeed it was best that she could not hear. My only fear was that our pursuers, of whom there now seemed to be a dozen, had extended with the intention of encircling us. They, no doubt, knew every inch of that giant forest with its numerous bogs and marshes, and if they could not discover us, would no doubt drive us into one or other of the bogs, where escape was impossible. Our gallant guide, on the other hand, seemed to utterly disregard the danger, and kept on, every now and then stretching out his hand and helping along the afflicted girl we had rescued from that living tomb. Headlong we went in a straight line, until suddenly we began to feel our feet sinking into the soft ground, and then the Finlander turned to the left, at right angles, and we found ourselves in a denser undergrowth, where in the darkness our hands and faces became badly scratched. Another gun was fired as signal, echoing through the wood, but the sound came from the opposite direction to that we were traveling. Therefore we hoped that we had eluded those whose earnest desire it was to capture us for the reward. Suddenly, however, a second gun, an answering signal, was fired from straight before us, and that revealed the truth. We were actually between the two parties, and they were closing in upon us. They had already driven us to the edge of the bog. The Finlander recognized our peril as quickly as I did, and halted. "Let us turn straight back," he urged breathlessly. "We may yet elude them." And then we again turned off at right angles, traveling as quickly as we were able back towards the lake shore. It was an exciting chase in the darkness, for we knew not whither we were going, nor into what pitfall or ravine or treacherous marsh we might fall. Once we saw afar through the trees the light of a lantern held by a guard, and already the sweet-faced girl beside me seemed tired and terribly fatigued. But we hurried on and on, striving to make no noise, and yet the crackling of wood beneath our feet seemed to us to sound like the noise of thunder. At last, breathless, we halted to listen. We were already in sight of the gray mist where lay the silent lake that held so many secrets. There was not a sound. The guards had gone straight on, believing they had driven us into that deadly bog wherein, if we had entered, we must have been slowly sucked down and engulfed. They were surrounding it, no doubt, feeling certain of their prey. But we crept along the water's edge, until in the gray light we could distinguish two empty boats, that of the guards and our own. We were again at the spot where we had disembarked. "Let us row to the head of the lake," suggested the Finn. "We may then land and escape them." And a moment later we were all three in the guard's boat, rowing with all our might under the deep shadow of the bank northward, in the opposite direction to the town of Nystad. We kept a sharp lookout for any other boat, but saw none. The signals ashore had attracted all the guards to that spot to join in the search, and now, having doubled back and again embarked, we were every moment increasing the distance between ourselves and our pursuers. I think we must have rowed several miles, for ere we landed again upon a low, flat, and barren shore, the first gray streak of day was showing in the east. Elma noticed it, and kept her great brown eyes fixed upon it thoughtfully. It was the dawn for her, the dawn of a new life. Our eyes met. She smiled at me, and then gazed again eastward, full of silent meaning. Having landed, we drew the boat up and concealed it in the undergrowth, so that the guards on searching should not know the direction we had taken, and then we went straight on northward across the low-lying lands to where the forest showed dark against the morning gray. The mist had now somewhat cleared, but the air was keen and frosty. This wood, we found, was of tall, high pines, where walking was not difficult, a wide wilderness of trees which hour after hour we traversed in the vain endeavor to find the rough path which our guide told us led for 100 miles from Alivo down to Tammersfors, the manufacturing center of the country. But to discover a path in a forest 40 miles wide is a matter of considerable difficulty, and for hours we wandered on, but alas, always in vain. Faint and hungry, yet we still kept our courage. Fortunately we found a little spring, and all three of us drank eagerly with our hands. But of food we had nothing, save a small piece of hard rye bread which the Finn had in his pocket, the remains of his evening meal, and this we gave to Elma, who, half famished, ate it quickly. We knew quite well that it would be an easy matter to die of starvation in that great trackless forest. Therefore we kept on, undaunted, while the yellow autumn sun struggled through the dark pines, glinting on the straight gray trunks and reflecting a golden light in that dead, unbroken silence. How many miles we trudged, I have no idea. It was a consolation to know that we now had no pursuers, yet what fate lay before us we knew not. If we could only find that forest road, we might come across some woodcutter's hut, where we could obtain rough food of some sort. Yet our guide, used as he was to those enormous woods of central Finland, was utterly out of his bearings, and no mark of civilization attracted his quick, experienced eye. The light above gradually faded, and over a sharp stone Elma stumbled and ripped her shoe. I looked at my watch and found that it was already 5 o'clock. In an hour it would be dark, the beginning of the long northern night. Elma, who was weary and footsore, asked by signs to be permitted to lay down and rest. Therefore we gathered a bed of dried leaves for her, and she laid down, and while we watched she was soon asleep. The Finn, who declared that he did not suffer from the cold, removed his coat and placed it tenderly upon her shoulders. While there was still a ray of light, I watched her white, refined features as she slept, and was sorely tempted to bend and imprint a kiss upon that soft, inviting cheek. Yet I had no right to do so, no right to take such an advantage. The long, cold night passed wearily, and the howling of the wolves caused me to grip my revolver. Yet at daybreak we arose refreshed, and notwithstanding the terrible pangs of hunger now gnawing at our vitals, we were prepared to renew our desperate dash for liberty. Although I had paper, I possessed no pencil with which to write. Therefore I could only communicate by signs with the mysterious prisoner of Kajana, the beautiful, dark-eyed girl who held me irrevocably beneath the spell of her beauty. All the little acts of homage I was able to perform she accepted with a quiet, calm dignity, while in her deep, luminous eyes I read an unfathomable mystery. The mist had not cleared, for it was too soon after dawn when we again moved along, hungry, chill, and yet hopeful. At a spring we obtained some water, and then in silent procession pressed forward in search of the rough track of the woodcutters. Elma's torn shoe gave her considerable trouble, and noticing her limping, I induced her to sit down while I took it off, hoping to be able to mend it. But having unlaced it, I saw that upon her stocking was a large pat of congealed blood, where her foot itself had also been cut. I managed to beat the nails of the shoe with a stone, so that its sole should not be lost, and she readjusted it, allowing me to lace it up for her, and smiling the while. Forward we trudged, ever forward, across that enormous forest where the myriad tree trunks presented the same dismal scene everywhere, a forest untrodden save by wild, half-savage lumbermen. Throughout that dull gray day we marched onward, faint with hunger, yet suffering but little pain, for the first pangs were now past, and were succeeded by slight light-headedness. My only fear was that we should be compelled to spend another night without shelter, and what its effect might be upon the delicately reared girl whose hand I held tenderly in mine. Surely my position was a strange one. Her terrible affliction seemed to cause her to be entirely dependent upon me. Suddenly, just as the yellow sunlight overhead had begun to fade, the flat-faced Finn, whose name he had told me was Felix Estlander, cried joyfully: "Pour la Cité! Look, Excellency! Ah, the road at last!" And as we glanced before us, we saw that his quick, well-trained eyes had detected away in the twilight at some distance a path traversing our vista among the gray-green tree-trunks. Then, hurrying along, we found ourselves upon a track on which we turned to the right, a track rough and deeply rutted by the felled trunks that were dragged along it to the nearest river. Elma made a gesture of renewed hope, and all three of us redoubled our pace, expecting every moment to come upon some log hut, the owner of which would surely give us hospitality for the night. But darkness came on quickly, and yet we still pushed forward. Poor Elma was limping, and I knew that her injured foot was paining her, even though she could tell me nothing. At last, however, after walking for nearly 4 hours in the almost impenetrable forest gloom, always fearing lest we might miss the path, our hearts suddenly beat quickly by seeing before us a light shining in a window, and 5 minutes later Felix was knocking at the door and asking in Finnish the occupant to give hospitality to a lady lost in the forest. We heard a low growl, like a muttered imprecation within, and when the door opened there stood upon the threshold a tall, bearded, muscular old fellow in a dirty red shirt, with a big revolver shining in his hand. A quick glance at us satisfied him that we were not thieves, and he invited us in while Felix explained that we had landed from the lake, and our boat having drifted away we had been compelled to take to the woods. The man heard the Finn's picturesque story, and then said something to me which Felix translated into Russian. "Your Excellency is welcome to all the poor fare he has. He gives up his bed in the room yonder to the lady, so that she may rest. He is honored by your Excellency's presence." And while he was making this explanation, the Herculean woodcutter in the red shirt stirred the red embers whereon a big pot was simmering, and sending forth an appetizing odor, and in 5 minutes we were all three sitting down to a stew of capercailzie, with a foaming light beer as a fitting beverage. We finished the dish with such lightning rapidity that our host boiled us a number of eggs, which I fear denuded his larder. The place was a poor one of 2 low rooms, built of rough log pines, with double windows for the winter, and a high brick stove. Cleanliness was not exactly its characteristic, nevertheless we all passed a very comfortable hour, and received a warm welcome from the lonely old fellow who passed his life so far beyond European civilization, and whose house, he told us, was often snowed up and cut off from all the world for 3 or 4 months at a time. After we had finished our meal, I asked the sturdy old fellow for a pencil, but the nearest thing he possessed was a stick of thick charcoal, and with that it was surely difficult to communicate with our fair companion. Therefore she rose, gave me her hand, bowed smilingly, and then passed into the inner room and closed the door. The old woodcutter gave us some coarse tobacco, and after smoking and chatting for an hour, we threw ourselves wearily upon the wooden benches and slept soundly. Suddenly, however, at early dawn, we were startled by a loud banging at the door, the clattering of hoofs, and authoritative shouts in Russian. The old woodcutter sprang up, and looking through a chink in the heavy shutters, turned to us with blanched face, whispering breathlessly, "The police! What can they want of me?" "Open!" shouted the horseman outside. "Open in the name of His Majesty!" Felix and I sprang up, facing each other. We are entrapped. In an instant our guide Felix made a dash for the door of the inner room where Elma had retired, but next second he reappeared, gasping in Russian, "Excellency! Why, the door is open! The lady has gone!" "Gone!" I cried, dismayed, rushing into the little room, where I found the truckle couch empty, and the door leading outside wide open. She had actually disappeared. The police again banged at the opposite door, threatening loudly to break it in if it were not opened at once, whereupon the old woodcutter drew the bolt and admitted them. 2 big hulking fellows in heavy riding coats and swords strode in, while 2 others remained mounted outside, holding the horses. "Your names?" demanded one of the fellows, glancing at us as we stood together in expectation. Our host told them his name, and asked why they wished to enter. "We are searching for a woman who has escaped from Kajana," was the reply. "Have you seen any woman here?" "No," responded the woodcutter. "We never see any woman out in these woods." The police officer strode into the inner room, glanced around to make certain that no one was concealed there, and then returning to me asked, "Who are you?" "That is my own affair," I answered. The mystery of Elma's disappearance while we had slept annoyed me. She seemed to have fled from me in secret. Yet could she have received some warning that the police were in search of her? She was deaf, therefore she could not have been alarmed by the banging on the door. "Your identity is my affair," declared the man with the fair, bristly beard, an average type of the uncouth officer of police. "Who is your chief?" I inquired, as a sudden thought occurred to me. "Melnikoff, at Helsingfors." "Then this is not in the district of Abo?" "No, but what difference does it make? Who are you?" "Gordon Gregg, British subject," I replied. "And you are the drosky driver from Abo?" remarked the fellow, turning to Felix. Exactly as I thought. You are the pair who bribed the nun at Kajana, and succeeded in releasing the Englishwoman. In the name of the Czar, I arrest you." The old woodcutter turned pale as death. We certainly were in grave peril, for I foresaw the danger of falling into the hands of Baron Oberg, the Strangler of Finland. Yet we had a satisfaction in knowing that, be the mystery what it might, Elma had escaped. "And on what charge, pray, do you presume to arrest me?" I inquired as coolly as I could. "For aiding a prisoner to escape." "Then I wish to say, first, that you have no power to arrest me, and secondly, that if you wish me to give you satisfaction, I am perfectly willing to do so, providing you first accompany me down to Abo." "It is outside my district," growled the fellow, but I saw that his hesitancy was due to his uncertainty as to whom I really might be. "I desire you to take me to the Chief of Police Borenski, who will make all the explanation necessary. Until we have an interview with him, I refuse to give you any information concerning myself," I said. "But you have a passport?" I drew it from my pocket, saying, "It proves, I think, that my name is what I have told you." The fellow, standing astride, read it and handed it back to me. "Where is the woman?" he demanded. "Tell me." "I don't know," was my reply. "Perhaps you will tell me," he said, turning to the old woodcutter, with a sinister expression upon his face. "Remember, these fugitives are found in your house, and you are liable to arrest." "I don't know, indeed I don't," protested the old fellow, trembling beneath the officer's threat. Like all his class, he feared the police, and held them in dread. "Ah, you don't remember, I suppose," he smiled. "Well, perhaps your memory will be refreshed by a month or two in prison. You are also arrested." "But, your Excellency, I—" "Enough!" blared the bristly officer. "You have given shelter to conspirators. You know the penalty in Finland for that, surely." "But these gentlemen are surely not conspirators," the poor old man protested. "His Excellency is English, and the English do not plot." "We shall see afterwards," he laughed. And then, turning to the agent of police at his side, he gave him orders to search the log hut carefully, an investigation in which one of the men from the outside joined. They upset everything and pried everywhere. "You may find papers or letters," said the officer. "Search thoroughly." And in every corner they rummaged, even to taking up a number of boards in the inner room which Elma had occupied. But they found nothing. A dozen times was the old woodcutter questioned, but he stubbornly refused to admit that he had ever set eyes upon Elma, while I insisted on my right to return to Abo and see Boranski. I knew, of course, by what we had overheard said by the prison guards, that the Governor-General was extremely anxious to recapture the girl with whom, I frankly admit, I had now so utterly fallen in love. And it appeared that no effort was being spared to search for us. Indeed, the whole of the police in the provinces of Abo and Helsingfors seemed to be actively making a house-to-house search. But what could be the truth of Elma's disappearance? Had she fled of her own accord, or had she once more fallen a victim to some ingenious and dastardly plot? That gray dress of hers might, I recollected, betray her if she dared to venture near any town, while her affliction would of itself be plain evidence of identification. All I hoped was that she had gone and hidden herself in the forest somewhere in the vicinity to wait until the danger of recapture had passed. For nearly half an hour I argued with the police officer whose intention it was to take me under arrest to Helsingfors. Once there, however, I knew too well that my liberty would be probably gone for ever. Whatever was the Baron's motive in holding the poor girl a prisoner, it would also be his motive to silence me. I knew too much for his liking. "I refuse to go to Helsingfors," I said defiantly. "I am a British subject, and demand to be taken back to the port where my passport was vised." This argument I repeated time after time, until at length I succeeded in convincing him that I really had a right to be taken to Abo, and to seek the aid of the British Vice-Consul if necessary. For as long as possible I succeeded in delaying our departure, but at length, just as the yellow sun began to struggle through the gray clouds, we were all three compelled to depart in sorrowful procession. What, we wondered, had really happened to Elma? It was evident that she had not fallen into the hands of the police. Nevertheless, the fact that the door of the inner room was open caused them to look upon the statement of the woodcutter with distinct suspicion and disbelief. Our captors seemed quite well aware of all the circumstances of our escape from Kajana, and were consequently filled with chagrin that Elma, the person they so much desired to recapture, had slipped through their fingers. While the police rode, we were compelled to walk before them, and after trudging 10 miles or so through the forest, we came across another small posse of police, who were apparently in search of us, for they expressed delight when they saw us under arrest. "Where is the woman?" inquired one officer of the other. "Still at liberty," replied the man who held us as prisoners. "In hiding 20 versts back, I think." "Ah, we shall find her before long," he said confidently. "Within 12 hours we shall have searched the whole forest. She cannot escape us." Our captors explained who we were, and then we were pushed forward again, skirting a great wide lake called the Nasjarvi, along the wooded shore of which we walked the whole day long until, at sundown, we came to a picturesque little log-built town facing the water, called Filppula. Here we obtained a hasty meal, and afterwards took the train down to Abo, where we arrived next morning, after a very uncomfortable and sleepless journey. At 9 o'clock I stood in the big bare office of Michael Boranski, where only a few days before we had had such a heated argument. As soon as the chief of police entered, he recognized me under arrest, and dismissed my guards with the wave of a hand, all save the officer who had brought me there. The Finnish driver and the old woodcutter were in another room, therefore I stood alone with the police officer of Helsingfors and the chief of police at Abo. The latter listened to the officer's story of my arrest without saying a word. "The prisoner, your Excellency, desired to be brought here to you before being taken to Helsingfors. He said you would be aware of the facts." "And so I am," remarked Boranski with a smile. "There is no conspiracy. You must at once release this gentleman and the other 2 prisoners." "But, Excellency, the Governor-General has issued orders for the prisoner's arrest and deportation to Helsingfors." "That may be, but I am Chief of Police in Abo, and I release him." The officer looked at me in such blank astonishment that I could not resist smiling. "I am well aware of this Englishman's visit to the north," added Boranski. "More need not be said. Has the lady been arrested?" "No, your Excellency. Every effort is being made to find her. Colonel Smirnoff has already been relieved of his post as Governor of Kajana, and many of the guards are under arrest for complicity in the plot to allow the woman to escape." "Ah, yes. I see from the dispatches that a reward is offered for her recapture." "The Governor-General is determined that she shall not escape," remarked the other. "She is probably hidden in the forest, somewhere or other. Of course, they are making a thorough search over every verst of it. If she is there, she will most certainly be found." "No doubt," remarked Boranski, leaning back in his padded chair and looking at me meaningly across the littered table. "And now I wish to speak to this Englishman privately, so please leave us. Also inform the other 2 prisoners that they are at liberty." "But your Excellency does this upon his own responsibility," he said anxiously. "Remember that I brought them to you under arrest." "And I release them entirely at my own discretion," he said. "As Chief of Police of this province, I am permitted to use my jurisdiction, and I exercise it in this matter. You are liberty to report that at Helsingfors, if you so desire. But I should suggest that you say nothing, unless absolutely obliged. You understand?" The manner in which Boranski spoke apparently decided my captor, for after a moment's hesitation he said, saluting, "If that is really your wish, then I will obey." And he left. "Excellency!" exclaimed the Chief of Police, rising quickly and walking towards me as soon as the door was closed, and we were alone. "You have had a very narrow escape, very. I did my best to assist you. I succeeded in bribing the water guards at Kajana in order that you might secure the lady's release. But it seems that just at the very moment when you were about to get away, one of the guards turned informer and roused the governor of the castle, with the result that you all 3 nearly lost your lives. The whole matter has been reported to me officially, and," he added with a grim smile, "my men are now searching everywhere for you." "But why is Baron Oberg so extremely anxious to recapture Miss Heath?" I asked earnestly. "I have no idea," was his reply. "The secret orders from Helsingfors to me are to arrest her at all hazards, alive or dead." "Which means that the Baron would not regret if she was dead," I remarked, in response to which he nodded in the affirmative. I told him of the faithful services of Felix the Finlander, whereupon he said simply: "I told you that you might trust him implicitly." "But now that you have shown yourself my friend," I said, "you will assist Miss Heath to escape this man, who deserves to hold her prisoner in that awful place. They are driving her mad." "I will do my best," he answered, but shaking his head dubiously. "But you must recollect that Baron Oberg is Governor-General of Finland, with all the powers of the Czar himself. And if Elma Heath again falls into his unscrupulous hands, she will die," I declared. "Ah!" he sighed, looking me straight in the face. "I fear that what you say is only too true. She evidently holds some secret which he fears she will reveal. He wishes to rearrest her in order well," he added in a low tone, "in order to close her lips. It would not be the first time that persons have been silenced in secret at Kajana. Many fatal accidents take place in that fortress, you know." End of chapter 11, part 2. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 12 of The Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 12. The Strangler. Where was Elma? What was the cause of her inexplicable disappearance into the gloomy forest while we had slept? I returned to the hotel where I had stayed on my arrival, a comfortable place called the Phoenix, and lunched there alone. Both Felix, the Finn, and my host, the woodcutter, had received their douceurs and left, but to the last named I had given instructions to return home at once and report by telegraph any news of my lost one. A thousand conflicting thoughts arose within me as I sat in that crowded salle à manger, filled with a gobbling crowd of the commercial men of Abo. I had, I recognized, now to deal with the most powerful man in that country, and I suffered a distinct disadvantage by being in ignorance of the reason he held that sweet English girl a prisoner. The tragedy of the dastardly manner in which she had been willfully maimed caused my blood to boil within me. I had never believed that in this civilized 20th century such things could be. Michael Boranski had given his pledge to assist me, yet he had most plainly explained to me his fears. The Baron was intent upon again getting Elma into his power. Was it at his orders, I wondered, that the sweet-faced girl had been deprived of speech and hearing? Had she fallen an innocent victim to his infamous scheming? About me men were eating strange dishes and talking in Finnish, while others were smoking and drinking their vodka, but I was in no mood for observation. My only thought was of she who was now lost to me. Why had she disappeared without warning I was at loss to imagine, yet I could only surmise that her flight had been compulsory. Some women possess a mysterious sense of intuition, a curious and indescribable faculty of knowing when evil threatens them, that presents a strange and puzzling problem to our scientists. It is unaccountable, and yet many women possess it in a very marked degree. Was it therefore possible that Elma had awakened, and being warned of her peril had fled without arousing us? The suggestion was possible, but I feared improbable. Another very curious feature in the affair was the sudden manner in which Michael Boranski had exerted his power and influence in order to render me that service. He had actually bribed the guards of Kajana. He had instructed the faithful Felix. He had provided our boat, and he had ordered the nun to open the water gate to me. Why? There was, I felt convinced, some hidden motive in all that sudden and marked friendliness. That he really hated the English I had seen plainly when we had first met, and I had only compelled him to serve me by presenting the order signed by the Emperor, which made me his guest within the Russian dominions. Even that document did not account for the length he had gone to secure the release of the woman I now loved in secret. The more I thought it over, the more anxious did I become. I could discern no motive for his friendliness, and, truth to tell, I always distrust those who are too friendly. What straight and decided line of action should I take? Carefully I went over all the strange events that had happened in England, and while anxious to obtain some solution of the amazing problem, yet I could not bring myself to leave Finland and allow Elma to fall into the clutches of that high official who so persistently sought her end. No, I would go to him and face him. I was anxious to see what manner of man was the Strangler of Finland. Therefore that same evening I left Abo, and traveled by rail up to the junction of Toijala, whence, after a wait of 6 hours, I resumed by slow journey to Helsingfors. I put up at Kamp's, an elegant hotel on the long esplanade overlooking the port, and found the town with its handsome streets and spacious squares to be a much finer place than I had believed. When I inquired of the French director of my hotel for the residence of His Excellency, the Governor-General, he regarded me with some surprise, saying, "The Baron lives up at the palace, monsieur. That great building opposite the Salutong. The driver of your drosky will point it out to you." "Is His Excellency in Helsingfors at the present moment?" I asked. "The Baron never leaves the palace, monsieur," responded the man. "This is a strange country, you know," he added with a grin. "It is said that His Excellency is in hourly fear of assassination." "Perhaps not without cause," I remarked in a low voice, at which he elevated his shoulders and smiled. At noon I descended from a drosky before a long, gray, massive building, over the big doorway of which was a large escutcheon bearing the Russian arms emblazoned in gold, and on entering where a sentry stood on either side, a colossal concierge in livery of bright blue and gold came forward to meet me, asking in Russian, "Whom do you wish to see?" "His Excellency, the Governor-General." "Have you an appointment?" "No." "His Excellency sees no one without an appointment," the man told me somewhat gruffly. "I am not here on public business, but upon a private matter," I explained. "Perhaps I may see His Excellency's secretary." "If you wish. But I repeat that His Excellency sees no one without a previous appointment." I knew this quite well, for the Strangler of Finland, fearful of assassination, was as unapproachable as the Czar himself. Following the directions of the concierge, however, I crossed a great bare courtyard, and ascending a wide stone staircase, was confronted by a servant, who, on hearing my inquiry, took me into a waiting-room and left with my card to Colonel Luganski, whom he informed me was the Baron's private secretary. After 10 minutes or so the man returned, saying, "The Colonel will see you if you will please step this way," and following him he conducted me into the richly furnished private apartments of the palace, across a great hall filled with fine paintings, and then up a long, thickly carpeted passage to a small, elegant room, where a tall, bald-headed man in military uniform stood awaiting me. "Your name is Monsieur Gregg," he exclaimed in very good French, "and I understand you desire audience of His Excellency the Governor-General. I regret, however, that he never gives audience to strangers." "The matter upon which I desire to see His Excellency is of a purely private and confidential nature," I said, for used as I was to the ways of foreign officialdom, I spoke with the same firm courtesy as himself. "I am very sorry, monsieur, but I fear it will be necessary in that case for you to write to His Excellency, and mark your letter personal. It will then go into the Governor-General's own hands." "What I have to say cannot be committed to writing," was my reply. "I must see Baron Oberg upon a matter which affects him personally, and which admits of no delay." He glanced at me quickly, and then in a low voice inquired, "Is it in regard to Well, a conspiracy?" His question instantly suggested to me a ruse, and I replied in the affirmative. "Then you can place the facts before me without the slightest hesitation," he said, going to the door and slipping the bolt into its socket. "Anything spoken into my ear is as though it were spoken into that of His Excellency himself. I much regret, Monsieur the Colonel, that I must see the Baron in person." "Has the plot assassination as its object, or revolt?" he asked pointedly. "That I will explain to the Baron only." "But I tell you he will not see you. We have so many persons here with secret information concerning finished conspiracies against our Russian rule. Why, if His Excellency saw everyone who desired to see him, he would be compelled to give audience the whole 24 hours round." At a glance I saw that this elegant colonel, who seemed to take the greatest pride over his exquisitely kept person and his spotless uniform, did not intend to allow me the satisfaction of an audience of that most hated official of the Czar. The latter was in fear of the dagger, the pistol, or the bomb, and consequently hedged himself in by persons of the colonel's type, courteous, diplomatic, but utterly unbending. After some further argument, I said at last in a firm tone: "I wish to impress upon you the extreme importance of the information I have to impart, and can only repeat that it is a matter concerning His Excellency privately. Will you therefore do me the favor to take my name to him?" "His Excellency refuses to be troubled with the names of strangers," was his cold reply, as he turned over my card in his hand. "But if I write upon it the nature of my business, and enclose it in an envelope, will you then take it to him?" I suggested. He hesitated for a short time, twisting his moustache, and then replied with great reluctance: "Well, if you are so determined, you may write your business upon your card." I therefore took out one, and on the back wrote in French the words which I knew must have the effect of obtaining an audience for me: "To give information regarding Miss Elma Heath." This I enclosed in the envelope he handed to me, when, ringing a bell, he handed it to the footman who appeared, with orders to take it to His Excellency and await a reply. The response came in a few minutes: "His Excellency will give audience to the English monsieur." Then I rose and followed the footman through several wide corridors filled with palms and flowers, which formed a kind of winter garden, until we crossed a red-carpeted ante-room, where two statuesque sentries stood on guard, and the man conducting me rapped at the great polished mahogany doors of the room beyond. A voice responded, the door was opened, and I found myself in a high, beautifully painted room, with long windows hung with pastel blue silk with heavy gilt fringe, a pastel blue carpet, and upon the opposite wall a great canopy of rich purple velvet bearing the double-headed eagle embroidered in gold. The apartment was splendidly decorated, and in the center of the parquet floor, with his back to the light, was the thin, wiry figure of an elderly man in a funereal frock coat, in the lapel of which showed the red and yellow ribbon of the Order of Saint Anne. His hands were behind his back, and he stood purposely in such a position that when I entered I could not at first see his face against the strong gray light behind. But when the footman had bowed and retired, and we were alone, he turned slightly, and I then saw that his bony face, with high cheek-bones, slight gray side whiskers, hard mouth, and black eyes set closely together, was one that bore the mark of evil upon it, the keen, sinister countenance of one who could act without any compunction and without regret. Truly, one would not be surprised at any cruel, dastardly action of a man with such a face, the face of an oppressor. "Well?" he snapped in French in a high-pitched voice. "You want to see me concerning that mad English girl. What picturesque lies do you intend to tell me concerning her?" "I have no intention of telling any untruths concerning her," was my quick response, as I faced him unflinchingly. "She has told me sufficient to—" "She has told you something? Ah! I guessed as much. I expected this," and I saw that his thin, crafty face went pale, while his eyes glanced evilly upon me. He believed that she had revealed to me her secret, He placed his hand upon the back of a chair wherein was concealed an electric button, and next instant a little stout man in shabby black appeared as though by magic through a secret door hidden in the dark paneling of the audience chamber, the man who was his personal guard against the plots for his assassination. His Excellency spoke, and the words he uttered staggered me. I stood aghast. "Seize that man!" he cried, pointing to me. "He is armed. He has just threatened to kill me. He is the man against whom we were recently warned, the Englishman." "Ah!" I cried, standing before the thin-faced official of the Czar, the unscrupulous man who had crushed Finland beneath the iron heel of Russia, and who, by his lying allegation, now held me in his power. "I see your object, Baron Oberg. You intend to arrest me as a conspirator. Search the fellow. He has a revolver there in his hip pocket," declared the Governor-General. And in an instant the short, ferret-eyed little man had run his hands down me and felt my weapon. I drew it forth and handed it to him, saying, "You are quite welcome to it if you fear that I am here with any sinister motive." "He obtained admission by a clever ruse," the Baron explained to the police agent, "and then he threatened me." "It's untrue!" I protested hotly. "I have merely called to see you regarding the young English lady, Elma Heath, the unfortunate lady whom you consigned to the fortress of Kajana." "The mad woman, you mean!" he laughed. "She is not mad," I cried, "but as sane as you yourself. It is you who intended that the horrors of the castle should drive her insane, and thus your secret should be kept." "What do you suggest?" he demanded, stepping a few paces towards me. "I mean, Xavier Oberg, that you would kill Elma Heath if you dared to do so," I answered plainly as I faced him unflinchingly. "You see," he laughed, turning to the stout man at my side. "The fellow is insane. He does not know what he is talking about. Ah, my dear Malkoff, I've had a narrow escape. He came here intending to shoot me." "I did not," I protested. "I am here to demand satisfaction on behalf of Miss Heath." "Oh. Well, if the lady cares to come here herself, I will give her the satisfaction she desires," was his crafty reply. "The lady has escaped you, and it is therefore hardly likely she will willingly return to Helsingfors," I said. "It was you who succeeded, by throwing the guard into the water, in abducting her from the castle," he remarked. "But," he added sneeringly, with a sinister smile, "I presume your gallantry was prompted by affection, eh?" "That is my own affair." "A deaf and dumb woman is surely not a very cheerful companion." "And who caused her that affliction?" I cried hotly. "When she was at Chichester she possessed speech and hearing as other girls. Indeed, she was not afflicted when on board the Lola in Leghorn harbor only a few months ago. Perhaps you recollect the narrow escape the yacht had on the Meloria sands?" His eyes met mine, and I saw by his drawn face and narrow brows that my words were causing him the utmost consternation. My object was to make him believe that I knew more than I really did, to hold him in fear, in fact. "Perhaps the man whom some know as Hornby or Woodroffe could tell an interesting story," I went on. "He will, no doubt, when he meets Elma Heath, and finds the terrible affliction of which she has been the victim." His thin bony countenance was bloodless, his mouth twitched, and his gray brows contracted quickly. "I haven't the least idea what you mean, my dear sir," he stammered. "All that you say is entirely enigmatical to me. What have I to do with this mad Englishwoman's affairs?" "Send out this man," I said, pointing to the detective Malkoff, who had appeared from behind the paneling of the audience chamber. "Send him out, and I will tell you." But the representative of the Czar, always as much in dread of assassination as his imperial master, refused. I saw that what I had said had upset him, and that he was not at all clear as to how much or how little of the true facts I knew. The connection between the little miniature cross of the Order of St. Anne and that red and yellow ribbon in his buttonhole struck me forcibly at the moment, and I said: "I have no desire to make any statements before a second person. I came here to see you privately, and in private will I speak. I have certain information that will, I feel confident, be of the utmost interest to you, concerning another woman, Armida Santini." His lips were pressed together, and I noticed how he started when I uttered the name of that woman whom I had found dead in Rannoch Wood, and whose body had so mysteriously disappeared. "And what on earth can the woman concern me?" he asked, with a brave attempt to remain cool, still speaking in French. "Only that you knew her," was my brief reply. Then, with my eyes still fixed upon his, I asked, "Will you not now request this gentleman to retire?" He hesitated a moment, and then with a wave of his hand dismissed the man he had summoned to his aid. A moment later the Strangler's personal protector had disappeared through that secret door in the paneling by which he had entered. "Well?" asked the Baron, turning quickly to me again, his dark evil eyes trying to fathom my intentions. "Well?" I asked. "And what, pray, can you profit by denouncing me as an assassin? Remember, Baron, that your secret is mine," I said in a clear voice full of meaning. "And your intention is blackmail, eh?" he snapped, walking to the window and back again. "How much do you want?" "My intention is nothing of the kind. My object is to avenge the outrageous injury to Elma Heath." "Of course, that is only natural, monsieur, if you have fallen in love with her," he said. "But are not your intentions somewhat ill-advised, considering her position as a criminal lunatic?" "She is neither," I protested quickly. "Very well, you know better than myself," he laughed. "The offense for which she was condemned to confinement in a fortress was the attempted assassination of Madame Vakuroff, wife of the general commanding the Audiobook military division." "Assassination!" I cried. "Have you actually sent her to prison as a murderess?" "I have not. The Criminal Board of Abo did so," he said dryly. "The offense has since been proved to have been the outcome of a political conspiracy, and the Minister of the Interior in Petersburg last week signed an order for the prisoner's transportation to the island of Saghalien." "Ah!" I remarked with set teeth. "Because you fear lest she shall write down your secret." "You are insulting. You evidently do not know what you are saying," he exclaimed resentfully. "I know what I am saying quite well. You have requested her removal to Saghalien, in order that the truth shall never be known. But, Baron Oberg," I added with mock politeness, "you may do as you will. You may send Elma Heath to her grave. You may hold me prisoner if you dare. But there are still witnesses of your crime that will rise against you." In an instant he went ghastly pale, and I knew that my blind shot had struck its mark. The man before me was guilty of some crime, but what it was only Elma herself could tell. That he had had her arrested for an attempted political assassination only showed how ingeniously and craftily the heartless ruler of that ruined country had laid his plans. He feared Elma, and therefore had conspired to have her sent out to that dismal penal island in the far-off Pacific. "You do not fear arrest, monsieur?" he asked, as though with some surprise. "Not in the least. At least, not arrest by you. You may be the representative of the Emperor in Finland, but even here there is justice for the innocent." A sinister smile played around the thin gray lips of the man whose very name was hated through the great empire of the Czar, and was synonymous of oppression, injustice, and heartless tyranny. "All I can repeat," he said, "is that if you bring the young Englishwoman here, I shall be quite prepared to hear her appeal." And he laughed harshly. "You ask that because you know it is impossible," I said, whereat he again laughed in my face, a laugh which made me wonder whether Elma had not already fallen into his hands. The uncertainty of her fate held me in terrible suspense. "I merely wish to impress upon you the fact that I have not the slightest interest whatever in the person in question," he said coldly. "You seem to have formed some romantic attachment towards this young woman who attempted to poison Madame Vakuroff, and to have succeeded in rescuing her from Kajana. You afterwards disregard the fact that you are liable to a long term of imprisonment yourself, and actually have the audacity to seek audience of me, and make all sorts of hints and suggestions that I have held the woman a prisoner for my own ends." "Not only do I repeat that, Baron Oberg," I said quickly, "but I also allege that it was at your instigation that in Siena an operation was performed upon the unfortunate girl, which deprived her of speech and hearing." "At my instigation?" "Yes, at yours." He laughed again, but uneasily, a forced laugh, and leaned against the edge of the big writing table near the window. "Well, what next?" he inquired, pretending to be interested in my allegations. "What do you want of me?" "I desire you to give the Mademoiselle Heath her complete freedom," I said. "Is that all?" "All for the present. But her future is not in my hands. The minister in Petersburg has decreed her removal to Saghalien, as a person dangerous to the state." "Which means that she will be ill-treated, knouted to death, perhaps." "We do not use the knout in the Russian prisons nowadays," he said briefly. "His Majesty has decreed its abolition." "But you adopt torture in Kajana and Schusselburg instead." "My time is too limited to discuss our penal system, monsieur," he exclaimed impatiently, while I could well see that he was anxious to escape before I made any further charges against him. I had already shown him that Elma had spoken, and he feared that she had told the truth. While this would embitter him against her, and cause him to seek to silence her at all hazards, it was of course in my own interest that he should fear any revelations that I might make. "You have posed in England as the uncle of Elma Heath, and yet you hold her prisoner. For what reason?" I demanded. "She is held prisoner by the state for conspiracy against Russian rule, not by herself personally." "Who enticed her here?" "Why, you yourself. Who conspired to throw the guilt of this attempted murder of the General's wife upon her? You, the man whom they call the Strangler of Finland. But I will avenge the cruel and abominable affliction you have placed upon her. Her secret, your secret, Baron Oberg, shall be published to the world. You are her enemy, and therefore mine. Very well," he growled between his teeth, advancing towards me threateningly, his fist clenched in rage. "Recollect, monsieur, that you have insulted me. Recollect that I am Governor-General of Finland. If you were Czar himself, I should not hesitate to denounce you as the tyrant and mutilator of a poor, defenseless woman." "And to whom, pray, will you tell this romantic story of yours?" he laughed hoarsely. "To your prison walls below the lake at Kajana? Yes, Monsieur Gregg, you will go there, and once within the fortress you shall never again see the light of day. You threaten me, the Governor-General of Finland!" He laughed in a strange, high-pitched key as he threw himself into a chair, and scribbled something rapidly upon paper, appending his signature in his small, crabbed handwriting. "I do not threaten," I said in open defiance. "I shall act." "And so shall I," he said with an evil grin upon his bony face as he blotted what he had written and took it up, adding, "In the darkness and silence of your living tomb you can tell whatever strange stories you like concerning me. They are use to idiots where you are going," he added grimly. "Oh, and where am I going?" "Back to Kajana. This order consigns you to confinement there as a dangerous political conspirator, as one who has threatened me. It consigns you to the cells below the lake for life." I laughed aloud, and my hand sought my wallet wherein was that all-powerful document, the order of the Emperor which gave me, as an imperial guest, immunity from arrest. I would produce it as my trump card. Next second, however, I held my breath, and I think I must have turned pale. My pocket was empty. My wallet had been stolen. Entirely and helplessly I had fallen into the hands of the tyrant of the Czar. His own personal interest would be to consign me to a living tomb in that grim fortress of Kajana, the horrors of which were unspeakable. I had seen enough during my inspection of the Russian prisons as a journalist to know that there, in strangled Finland, I should not be treated with the same consideration or humanity as in Petersburg or Warsaw. The Governor-General consigned me to Kajana as a political, which was synonymous with the sentence of death in those damp, dark oubliettes beneath the water dungeons every whit as awful as those of the Paris Bastille. We faced each other, and I looked straight into his gray, bony face, and answered in a tone of defiance. "You are Governor-General, it is true, but you will, I think, reflect before you consign me, an Englishman, to prison without trial. I know full well that the English are hated by Russia. Yet I assure you that in London we entertain no love for your nation or its methods." "Yes," he laughed, "you are quite right. Russia has no use for an effete ally, such as England is." "Effete or powerful, my country is still able to present an ultimatum when diplomacy requires it," I said. "Therefore I have no fear. Send me to prison, and I tell you that the responsibility rests upon yourself." And folding my arms, I kept my eyes intently upon his, so that he should not see that I wavered. "As for the responsibility, I certainly do not fear that, monsieur," he said. "But that exposure that will result, are you prepared to face that?" I asked. "Perhaps you are not aware that others besides myself, one other indeed, who is a diplomatist, is aware of my journey here? If I do not return, your Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Petersburg will be pressed for reason." "Which they will not give." "Then if they do not, the truth will be out," I said, laughing harshly, for I saw how determined he had become to hold me prisoner. "Come, call up your myrmidon and send me to Kajana. It will be the first step towards your own downfall." "We shall see," he growled. "Ah, you surely do not think that I, after 10 years' service in the British diplomatic service, would dare to come to Finland upon this quest, would dare to face the rotten and corrupt officialdom which Russia has placed within this country, without first taking some adequate precaution? No, Baron. Therefore I defy you, and I leave Helsingfors to-night." "You will not. You are under arrest." I laughed heartily, and snapped my fingers, saying, "Before you give me over to your police, first telegraph to your Minister of Finance, Monsieur de Witte, and inquire of him who and what I am." "I don't understand you." "You have merely to send my name and description to the minister, and ask for a reply," I said. "He will give you instructions, or, if you so desire, ask his Majesty yourself." "And why, pray, does his Majesty concern himself about you?" he asked at once, puzzled. "You will learn later, after I am confined in Kajana, and your secret is known in Petersburg." "What do you mean?" "I mean," I said, that I have taken all the necessary steps to be forearmed against you. The day I am incarcerated by your order, the whole truth will be known. I shall not be the sufferer, but you will." My words, purposely enigmatical, misled him. He saw the drift of my argument, and being of course unaware of how much I knew, he was still in fear of me. My only uncertainty was of the actual fate of poor Elma. My wallet had been stolen, with a purpose, without a doubt, for the thief had deprived me of that most important of all documents, the open sesame to every closed door, the ukase of the Czar. "You defy me?" he said hoarsely, turning back to the window with the written order for my imprisonment as a political still in his hand. "But we shall see." "You rule Finland," I said in a hard tone, "but you have no power over Gordon Gregg." "I have power, and intend to exert it." "For your own ruin," I remarked with a self-confident smile. "You may give your torturers orders to kill me, orders that a fatal accident shall occur within the fortress. But I tell you frankly that my death will neither erase nor conceal your own offenses. There are others away in England who are aware of them, and who will, in order to avenge my death, speak the truth. Remember that although Elma Heath has been deprived of both hearing and of speech, she can still write down the true facts in black and white. The Czar may be your patron, and you his favorite, but his Majesty has no tolerance of officials who are guilty of what you are guilty of. You talk of arresting me," I added with a smile. "Why, you ought rather to go on your knees and beg my silence." He went white with rage at my cutting sarcasm. He literally boiled over, for he saw that I was quite cool, and had no fear of him or of the terrible punishment to which he intended to consign me. Besides which, he was filled with wonder regarding the exact amount of information which Elma had imparted to me. "There are certain persons," I went on, "to whom it would be of intense interest to know the true reason why the steam yacht Lola put into Leghorn. why I was entertained on board her, why the safe in the British Consulate was rifled, and why the unfortunate girl, kept a prisoner on board, was taken on shore just before the hurried sailing of the vessel. And there are other mysteries which the English police are trying to solve, namely, the reason Armida Santini, and a man disguised as her husband, died in Scotland at the hand of an assassin. But surely I need say no more. It is surely sufficient to convince you that if the truth were spoken, the revelations would be distinctly awkward." "For whom?" he asked, opening his eyes. "For you. Come, Baron," I said. "Can we not yet speak frankly?" But he was silent for a moment, a fact which was in itself proof that my pointed argument had caused him to reconsider his intention of sending me under escort back to that castle of terror. If my journey there was in order to meet my love, I would not have cared. It was the ignorance of her whereabouts or of her fate that held me in such deep, all-consuming anxiety. Each hour that passed increased my fond and tender affection for her. And yet, what irony of circumstance! She had been cruelly snatched from me at the very moment that freedom had been ours. I think it was well that I assumed that air of defiance with the man who had ground Finland beneath his heel. He was unused to it. No one dared to go against his will, or to utter taunt or threat to him. He was paramount, with all the powers of an emperor, the power, indeed, of life and death. Therefore he was not in the habit of being either thwarted or criticized, and I could see that my words had aroused within him a boiling tumult of resentment and of rage. I told him nothing of the loss of my wallet or of the precious document that it had contained. My defiance was merely upon principle. Arrest me if you like. Denounce me by means of any lie that arises to your lips. But remember that the truth is known beyond the confines of the Russian Empire, and for that reason traces will be sought of me, and full explanation demanded. I have taken precaution, Xavier Oberg," I added. "Therefore do your worst. I repeat again that I defy you." He paced the big room, his thin, claw-like hands still clenched, his yellow teeth grinding, his dark, deep-set eyes fixed straight before him. If he had dared, he would have struck me down at his feet. But he did not dare. I saw too plainly that even though my wallet was gone, I still held the trump card, that he feared me. The mention I had made of the Minister of Finance, however, seemed to cause him considerable hesitation. That high official had the ear of the Emperor, and if I were a friend there might be inquiries. As I stood before him, leaning against a small buhl table, I watched all the complex workings of his mind, and tried to read the mysterious motive which had caused him to consign poor Elma to Kajana. He was a proud bully, possessing neither pity nor remorse, an average specimen of the high Russian official, a hide-bound bureaucrat, a slave to etiquette, and possessing a veneer of polish. But beneath it all I saw that he was a coward, in deadly fear of assassination, a coward who dreaded lest some secret should be revealed. That concealed door in the paneling with the armed guard lurking behind was sufficiently plain evidence that he was not the fearless Governor-General that was popularly supposed. He, the strangler of Finland, had crushed the gallant nation into submission, ruining their commerce, sapping the country by impressing its youth into the Russian army, forbidding the use of the Finnish language, and taxing the people until the factories had been compelled to close down while the peasantry starved. And now, on the verge of revolt, there had arisen a band of patriots who resented ruin, and who had already warned his Majesty by letter that if Baron Oberg were not removed from his post, he would die. These and other thoughts ran through my mind in the silence that followed our heated argument, for I saw well that he was in actual fear of me. I had led him to believe that I knew everything, and that his future was in my hands, while he, on his part, was anxious to hold me prisoner, and yet dared not do so. My wallet had probably been stolen by some lurking police spy, for Russian agents abound everywhere in Finland, reporting conspiracies that do not exist, and denouncing the innocent as politicals. The Baron had halted and was looking through one of the great windows down upon the courtyard below where the sentries were pacing. The palace was for him a gilded prison, for he dared not go out for a drive in one or other of the parks, or for a blow on the water across the Hogholmen or Dagero, being compelled to remain there for months without showing himself publicly. People in Abo had told me that when he did go out in the streets of Helsingfors, it was at night, and he usually disguised himself in the uniform of a private soldier of the guard, thus escaping recognition by those who, driven to desperation by injustice, sought his life. A long silence had fallen between us, and it now occurred to me to take advantage of his hesitation. Therefore I said in a firm voice, in French, "I think, Baron, our interview is at an end, is it not? Therefore I wish you good day." He turned upon me suddenly with an evil flash in his dark eyes, and a snarling imprecation in Russian upon his lips. His hand still held the order committing me to the fortress. "But before I leave you, you will destroy that document. It may fall into other hands, you know." And I walked towards him with quick determination. "I shall do nothing of the kind," he snapped. Without further word, I snatched the paper from his thin white fingers and tore it up before his face. His countenance went livid. I do not think I have ever seen a man's face assume such an expression of fiendish vindictiveness. It was as though at that instant hell had been let loose within his heart. But I turned upon my heel and went out, passing the sentries in the anteroom, along the flower-filled corridors, and across the courtyard to the main entrance, where the gorgeous concierge saluted me as I stepped forth into the square. I had escaped by means of my own diplomacy and firmness. The Czar's representative, the man who ruled that country, feared me, and for that reason did not hold me prisoner. Yet when I recalled that evil look of revenge on my departure, I could not help certain feelings of grave apprehension arising within me. Returning to my hotel, I smoked a cigar in my room and pondered. Where was Elma was the chief question which arose within my mind. By remaining in Helsingfors I could achieve nothing further, now that I had made the acquaintance of the oppressor, whereas if I returned to Abo I might perchance be able to obtain some clue to my love's whereabouts. I call her my love because I both pitied and loved the poor afflicted girl who was so helpless and defenseless. Therefore I took the midnight train back to Abo, arriving at the hotel next morning. After an hour's rest I set out anxiously in search of Felix, the drosky driver. I found him in his log-built house in the Ludno quarter, and when he asked me in I saw from his face that he had news to impart. "Well?" I inquired. "And what of the lady? Has she been found?" "Ah, your Excellency, it is a pity you were not here yesterday," he said with a sigh. "Why? Tell me quickly. What has happened?" "I have been assisting the police as spy, Excellency, as I often do, and I have seen her." "Seen her? Where?" I cried in quick anxiety. "Here in Abo. She arrived yesterday morning from Tammerfors, accompanied by an Englishman. She had changed her dress and was all in black. They lunched together at the Restaurant du Nord, opposite the landing stage, and an hour later left by steamer for Petersburg." "An Englishman!" I cried. "Did you not inform the Chief of Police, Boransky?" "Yes, your Excellency, but he said that their passports being in order, it was better to allow the lady to proceed. To delay her might mean her rearrest in Finland," he added. "Then their passports were viséed here on embarking!" I exclaimed. "What was the name upon that of the Englishman?" "I have written it down, Excellency. I cannot pronounce your difficult English names." And he produced a scrap of dirty paper, whereon was written in a Russian hand the name Martin Woodroffe. Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of the Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 13. A Double Game and Its Consequences. I went to the railway station, and from the timetable gathered that if I left Abo by rail at noon, I could be in Petersburg an hour before noon on the morrow, or about 4 hours before the arrival of the steamer by which the silent girl and her companion were passengers. This I decided upon doing, but before leaving I paid a visit to my friend Boransky, who, to my surprise and delight, handed me my wallet with the Czar's letter intact, saying that it had been found upon a German thief who had been arrested at the harbor on the previous night. The fellow had, no doubt, stolen it from my pocket, believing I carried my paper money in the flap. "The affair of the English lady is a most extraordinary one," remarked the Chief of Police, toying with his pen as he sat at his big table. "She seems to have met this Englishman up at Tammerfors, or at some place further north. Yet it is curious that her passport should be in order, even though she fled so precipitately from Kajana. There is a mystery connected with her disappearance from the woodcutter's hut that I confess I cannot fathom." "Neither can I," said. "I know the man who is with her, and cannot help fearing that he is her bitterest enemy, that he is acting in concert with the Baron." "Then why is he taking her to the capital, beyond the jurisdiction of the Governor-General?" "I am going straight to Petersburg to ascertain," I said. "I have only come to thank you for your kindness in this matter. Truth to tell, I have been somewhat surprised that you should have interested yourself on my behalf," I added, looking straight at the uniformed official. "It was not on yours, but on hers," he answered somewhat enigmatically. "I know something of the affair, but it was my duty as a man to help the poor girl to escape from that terrible place. She has, I know, been unjustly condemned for the attempted assassination of the wife of a general. Condemned with a purpose, of course. Such a thing is not unusual in Finland." "Abominable!" I cried. "Oberg is a veritable fiend." But the man only shrugged his shoulders, saying, "The orders of His Excellency the Governor-General have to be obeyed, whatever they are. We often regret, but we dare not refuse to carry them out." "Russia is a disgrace to our modern civilization," I declared hotly. "I have every sympathy with those who are fighting for freedom." "Ah, you are not alone in that," he sighed, speaking in a low whisper and glancing around. "His Majesty would order reforms and ameliorate the condition of his people, if only it were possible. But he, like his officials, are powerless. Here we speak of the great uprising with bated breath, but we, alas, know that it must come one day, very soon, and Finland will be the first to endeavor to break her bonds, and the Baron Oberg the first to fall." For nearly an hour I sat with him, surprised to find how, although his exterior was so harsh and uncouth, yet his heart really bled for the poor starving people he was so constantly forced to oppress. "I have ruined this town of Abo," he declared quite frankly. "To my own knowledge 500 innocent persons have gone to prison, and another 200 have been exiled to Siberia. Yet what I have done is only at direct orders from Helsingfors, orders that are stern, pitiless, and unjust. Men have been torn from their families and sent to the mines, women have been arrested for no offense and shipped off to Saghalien, and mere children have been cast into prison on charges of political conspiracy with their elders in order to Russify the province. Only," he added anxiously, "I trust you will never repeat what I tell you. You have asked me why I assisted the English Mademoiselle to escape from Kajana, and I have explained the reason." We ate a hearty meal in the company at the Sampalinna, a restaurant built like a Swiss chalet, and at noon I entered the train on the first stage of my slow, tedious journey through the great silent forests and along the shores of the lakes of southern Finland, by way of Tavestehus and Viborg, to Petersburg. I was alone in the compartment, and sat moodily watching the panorama of wood and river as we slowly wound up the tortuous ascents and descended the steep gradients. I had not even a newspaper with which to while away the time, only my own apprehensive thoughts of whither my helpless love was being conducted. Surely to no man was there ever presented such a complicated problem as that which I was now trying so vigorously to solve. I loved Elma Heath. The more I reflected, the deeper did her sweet countenance and tender grace impress themselves upon my heart. I loved her, therefore I was striving to overtake her. The steamer, I learned, would call at Hango and Helsingfors. Would they, I wonder, disembark at either of those places? Was the man whom I had known as Hornby, the owner of the Lola, taking her to place her again in the fiendish hands of Xavier Oberg? The very thought of it caused me to hold my breath. Daylight came at last, cold and gray, over those dreary interminable marshes where game, especially snipe, seemed abundant, and at a small station at the head of a lake called Davidstadt I took my morning glass of tea. Then we resumed our journey down to Viborg, where a short, thick-set Russian of the commercial class, but something of a dandy, entered my compartment, and we left express for Petersburg. We had passed by a small station called Galitsina, near which were many villas occupied in summer by families from Petersburg, and were traveling through the dense, gloomy pine woods, when my fellow traveler, having asked permission to smoke, commenced to chat affably. He seemed a pleasant fellow, and told me that he was a wool merchant, and that he had been having a pleasant vacation trout fishing in the Voski above the falls of Imatra, where the pools between the rapids abound with fish. He had told me that on account of the shore being so full of weeds and the clearness of the water, fishing from the banks was almost an impossibility, and how they had to accustom themselves to troll from a boat so small as to only accommodate the rower and the fisherman. Then he remarked suddenly: "You are English, I presume, possibly from Helsingfors?" "No," I answered, "from Abo. I crossed from Stockholm, and am going to Petersburg." "And I also. I live in Petersburg," he added. "We may perhaps meet one day. Do you know the capital?" I explained that I had visited it once before, and had done the usual round of sight-seeing. His manner was brisk and to the point, as became a man of business, but when we stopped at Bely Ostrof, on the opposite side of the small winding river that separates Finland from Russia proper, the customs officer who came to examine our baggage exchanged a curious, meaning look with him. My fellow traveler believed that I had not observed, yet, keenly on the alert as I now was, I was shrewd to detect the least sign or look, and I at once resolved to tell the fellow nothing further of my own affairs. He was, no doubt, a spy of the Stranglers, who had followed me all the way from Abo, and had only entered my carriage for the final stage of the journey. This revelation caused me some uneasiness, for even though I was able to evade the man on arrival in Petersburg, he could, no doubt, quickly obtain news of my whereabouts from the police to whom my passport must be sent. I pretended to doze, and lay back with my eyes half closed, watching him. When he found me disinclined to talk further, he took up the paper he had bought and became engrossed in it, while I, on my part, endeavored to form some plan by which to mislead and escape his vigilance. The fellow meant mischief, that I knew. If Elma was flying in secret and he watched me, he would know that she was in Petersburg. At all hazards, for my love's sake as well as for mine, I saw that I must escape him. The ingeniousness and cleverness of Oberg's spies was proverbial throughout Finland, therefore he might not be alone, or in any case, on arrival in Petersburg, would obtain assistance in keeping observation upon me. I knew that the Baron desired my death, and that therefore I could not be too wary of pitfalls. That fatal chair, so cunningly prepared for me in Lambeth, was still vividly within my memory. As we passed Lanskaya and ran through the outer suburbs of Petersburg, my fellow traveler became inquisitive as to where I was going, but I was somewhat unresponsive, and busied myself with my bag until we entered the great echoing terminus whence I could see the Neva gleaming in the pale sunlight and the city beyond. The fellow made no attempt to follow me. He was too clever a secret agent for that. He merely wished me grâce tout der, raised his hat politely, and disappeared. A porter carried my bag out of the station, and I drove across the bridge to the large hotel where I had stopped before, the Europe, on the corner of the Nevsky Prospect and the Michael Street. There I engaged a front room looking down into the broad Nevsky, had a wash, and then watched at the window for the appearance of the spy. I had already a good 4 hours before the steamer from Abo was due, and I intended to satisfy myself whether or not I was being followed. Within 20 minutes the fellow lounged alongside the opposite side of the road, just as I had expected. He had changed his clothes and presented such a different appearance that at first sight I failed to recognize him. He knew that I had driven there, and intended to follow me if I came forth. My position was one of extreme difficulty, for if I went down to the quay he would most certainly follow me. Having watched his movements for 10 minutes or so, I descended to the big salle à manger and there ate my luncheon, chatting to the French waiter the while. I sat purposely in an alcove, so as to be away from the other people lunching there, and in order that I might be able to talk with the waiter without being overheard. Just as I had finished my meal, and he was handing me my bill, I bent towards him and asked, "Do you want to earn 20 roubles?" "Well, monsieur," he answered, looking at me with some surprise, "they would be acceptable. I am a married man." "Well, I want to escape from this place without being observed. There is a disagreeable little matter regarding a lady, and I fear a fracas with a man who is awaiting me outside in the Nevsky." Then, seeing that he hesitated, I assured him that I had committed no crime, and that I should return for my baggage that evening. "You could pass through the kitchen and out by the servants' entrance," he said after a moment's reflection. "If monsieur so desires, I will conduct him out. The exit is in the back street which leads on to the Catherine Canal." "Excellent," I said. "Let us go. Of course you will say nothing?" "Not a word, monsieur," and he gathered up the notes, plus 20 roubles, with which I paid my bill, and taking my hat I followed him to the end of the salle à manger, behind a high wooden screen, across the huge kitchen, and then through a long stone corridor at the end of which sat a gruff old doorkeeper. My guide spoke a word to him, and then the door opened, and I found myself in a narrow back slum with the canal beyond. My first visit was to a clothier's, where I purchased and put on a new light overcoat, and then to a hatter's for a hat of different shape to that I was wearing. I carried the hat back to a quiet alley which I had noticed, and quickly exchanged the one I was wearing for it, leaving my old hat in a corner. Then I entered a café in order to while away the hours until the vessel from Finland was due. At 4 o'clock I was out upon the quay, straining my eyes seaward for any sign of smoke, but could see nothing. The sun was sinking, and the broad expanse of water westward danced like liquid gold. The light died out slowly, the cold gray of evening crept on. A chill wind sprang up and swept the quay, causing me to shiver. I asked of a dock laborer whether the steamer was usually late, whereupon he told me that it was often 5 or 6 hours behind time, depending upon the delay at Helsingfors. Twilight deepened into night, and the rain fell heavily, yet I still paced the wet flags in patience, my eyes ever seaward for the light of the vessel which I hoped bore my love. My presence there aroused some speculation among the loungers, I think. Nevertheless, I waited in deepest anxiety whether, after all, Elma and Hornby had not disembarked at Helsingfors. Soon after 10 o'clock a light shone afar off, and the movement of the police and porters on the quay told me that it was the vessel. Then, after a further anxious quarter of an hour, it came, amid great shouting and mutual imprecations, slowly alongside the quay, and the passengers at last began to disembark in the pelting rain. One after another they walked up the gangway, filing into the passport office and on into the custom house, people of all sorts and all grades, Swedes, Germans, Finns, and Russians, until suddenly I caught sight of two figures, one a man in a big tweed traveling coat and a golf cap, and the other the slight figure of a woman in a long dark cloak and a woolen tam o' shanter. The electric rays fell upon them as they came up the wet gangway together, and there once again I saw the sweet face of the silent woman whom I had grown to love with such fervent desperation. The man behind her was the same one who had entertained me on board the Lola, the man who was said to be the lover of the fugitive Muriel Leithcourt. Without betraying my presence, I watched them pass through the passport office and custom house, and then, overhearing the address which Martin Woodroffe gave the isvoshtchik, I stood aside, wet to the skin, and saw them drive away. At 11 o'clock on the following day I found myself installed in the Hôtel de Paris, a comfortable hostelry in the Little Morskaya, having succeeded in evading the vigilance of the spy who had so cleverly followed me from Abo, and in getting my suit-case round from the Hôtel Europe. I was beneath the same roof as Elma, although she was in ignorance of my presence. Anxious to communicate with her without Woodroffe's knowledge, I was now awaiting my opportunity. He had, it appeared, taken for her a pleasant front room with sitting-room adjoining on the first floor, while he himself occupied a room on the third floor. The apartments he had engaged for her were the most expensive in the hotel, and as far as I could gather from the French waiter, whom I judiciously tipped, he appeared to treat her with every consideration and kindness. "Ah, poor lady!" the man exclaimed as he stood in my room answering my questions. "What an affliction! She writes down all her orders, for she can utter no word." "Has the Englishman received any visitors?" I asked. "One man, a Russian, an official of police, I think." "If he receives anyone else, let me know," I said. "And I want you to give Mademoiselle a letter from me, in secret." "Bien, monsieur." I turned to the little writing table and scribbled a few hasty lines to my love, announcing my presence, and asking her to grant me an interview in secret as soon as Woodroffe was absent. I also warned her of the search for her instigated by the Baron, and urged her to send me a line in reply. The note was delivered into her hand, but although I waited in suspense nearly all day, she sent no reply. While Woodroffe was in the hotel, I dared not show myself lest he should recognize me. Therefore I was compelled to sham indisposition and to eat my meals alone in my room. Both the means by which she had met Martin Woodroffe and the motive were equally an enigma. By that letter she had written to her schoolfellow, it was apparent that she had some secret of his, for had she not wished to send him a message of reassurance that she had divulged nothing? This would seem that they were close friends. Yet, on the other hand, something seemed to me that he was acting falsely, and was really an ally of the Baron's. Why had he brought her to Petersburg? If he had desired to rescue her, he would have taken her in the opposite direction, to Stockholm, where she would be free, whereas he took her, an escaped prisoner, into the very midst of peril. It was true that her passport was in order, yet I remembered that an order had been issued for her transportation to Saghalien, and now, once arrested, she must be lost to me for ever. This thought filled me with fierce anxiety. She was in Petersburg, that city where police spies swarm, and where every fresh arrival is noted and his antecedents inquired into. No attempt had been made to disguise who she was. Therefore, before long, the police would undoubtedly come and arrest her as the escaped criminal from Kajana. For several hours I sat at my window, watching the life and movement down in the street below, my mind full of wonder and dark forebodings. Was Martin Woodroffe playing her false? Just after 6:30 the waiter entered, and handing me a note on a salver, said, "Mademoiselle has, I believe, only this moment been able to write in secret." I tore it open and read as follows: Dear friend, I am so surprised. I thought you were still in Abo. Woodroffe has an appointment at 8 o'clock on the other side of the city. Therefore, come to me at 8:15. I must see you, and at once. I am in peril. Elma Heath. My love was in peril. It was just as I had feared. I thanked Providence that I had been sent to help her, and extricate her from that awful fate to which the Strangler of Finland had consigned her. At the hour she named, after the waiter had come to me and announced the Englishman's departure, I descended to her sitting-room and entered without rapping, or if I had rapped she could not, alas, have heard. The apartment was spacious and comfortable, thickly carpeted, with heavy furniture and gilding. Before the long window were drawn curtains of dark green plush, and on one side was the high stove of white porcelain with shining brass bands, while from her low lounge-chair a slim, wan figure sprang up quickly and came forward to greet me, holding out both her hands and smiling happily. I took her hands in mine and held them tightly in silence for some moments, as I looked earnestly into those wonderfully brilliant eyes of hers. She turned away laughing, a slight flush rising to her cheeks in her confusion. Then she led me to a chair and motioned me to be seated. Ours was a silent meeting, but her gestures and the expression of her eyes were surely more eloquent than mere words. I knew well what pleasure that re-encounter caused her, equal pleasure with that it gave to me. Until that moment I had never really loved. I had admired and flirted with women. What man has not? Indeed, I had admired Muriel Leithcourt, but never until now had I experienced in my heart the real flame of true burning affection. The sweetness of her expression, the tender caress of those soft tapering hands, the deep mysterious look in those magnificent eyes, and the incomparable grace of all her movements combined to render her the most perfect woman I had ever met. Perfect in all, alas, save speech and hearing, of which with such dastard wantonness she had been deprived. She touched her red lips with the tip of her forefinger, opened her hands, and shrugged her shoulders with a sad gesture of regret. Then, turning quickly to some paper on the little table at her side, she wrote something with a gold pencil and handed it to me. It read: "Surely Providence has sent you here. Mr. Woodroffe must have followed you from England. He is my enemy. You must take me from here and hide me. They intend to send me into exile. Have you ever been in Petersburg before? Do you know anyone here?" Then, when I had read, she handed me her pencil, and below I wrote: "I will do my best, dear friend. I have been once in Petersburg, but is it not possible that we should escape at once from Russia?" "Impossible," she wrote. "We should both be arrested at the frontier. It would be best to go into hiding here in Petersburg. I believed Woodroffe to be my friend, but I have found only this day that he is my enemy. He knew that I was in Kajana, and was in Abo when he learned of my escape. He went with 2 other men in search of us, and discovered us that night when we sought shelter at the woodcutter's hut. Without making his presence known, he waited outside until you were asleep, and then he came and looked in at my window. At first I was alarmed, but quickly I saw that he was a friend. He told me that the police were in the vicinity, and intended to raid the hut. Therefore I fled with him, first down to the Tammerfors, and then to Abo, and on here. At that time I did not see the dastardly trap he had laid in order to get me out of the Baron's clutches and wring from me my secret. If I confess, he intends to give me up to the police, who will send me to the mines." "Does your secret concern him?" I asked in writing. "Yes," she wrote in response. "It would be equally in his interests as well as those of Baron Oberg if I were sent to Saghalien and my identity effaced. I am a Russian subject, as I have already told you. Therefore, with a ministerial order against me, I am in deadliest peril." "Trust in me," I scribbled quickly. "I will act upon any suggestion you make. Have you any female friend in whom you could trust to hide you until this danger is past?" "There is one friend, a true friend. Will you take a note to her?" she wrote, to which I instantly nodded in the affirmative. Then, rising, she obtained some ink and pen and wrote a letter, the contents of which she did not show me before she sealed it. I sat watching her beautiful head bent beneath the shaded lamplight, catching her profile, and noticing how eminently handsome it was, superb and unblemished in her youthful womanhood. I watched her write the superscription upon the envelope: Madame Olga Stassulevich, Modista, Skredna, Prospect 231, Vasili, Ostrov. I knew that the district was on the opposite side of the city, close to the Little Neva. "Take a drosky at once, see her, and await a reply. In the meantime, I will prepare to be ready when you return," she wrote. "If Olga is not at home, ask to see the Red Priest, in Russian. Krasny Pastor. Return quickly, as I fear Woodroffe may come back. If so, I am lost." I assured her I would not lose a single instant, and 5 minutes later I was tearing down the Moiskaya in a drosky, along the canal and across the Nicholas Bridge to the address upon the envelope. The house was, I found, somewhat smaller than its neighbors, but not let out in flats as the other. Upon the door was a large brass plate bearing the name Olga Stassulevich, Modes. I pressed the electric button, and in answer a tall, clean-shaven Russian servant opened the door. "Madame is not at home," was his brief reply to my inquiry. "Then I will see the Red Priest," I said in a lower tone. "I come from Elma Heath." Thereupon, without further word, the man admitted me into the long, dark hall, and closed the door with an apology that the gas was not lighted. But striking a match, he led me up the broad staircase and into a small, cosy, well-furnished room on the second floor, evidently the sitting-room of some studious person, judging from the books and critical reviews lying about. For a few minutes I waited there until the door reopened, and there entered a man of medium height, with a shock of long snow-white hair, and almost patriarchal beard, whose dark eyes that age had dimmed flashed out at me with a look of curious inquiry, and whose movements were those of a person not quite at his ease. "I have called on behalf of Mademoiselle Elma Heath, to give this letter to Madame Stassulevich, or, if she is absent, to place it in the hands of the Red Priest," I explained in my best Russian. "Very well, sir," the old man responded in quite good English. "I am the person you seek." And taking the letter he opened it and read it through. I saw by the expression on his furrowed face that its contents caused him the utmost consternation. His countenance, already pale, blanched to the lips, while in his eyes there shot a fire of quick apprehension. The thin, almost transparent hand holding the letter trembled visibly. "You know Mademoiselle, eh?" he asked in a hoarse, strained voice as he turned to me. "You will help her to escape?" "I will risk my own life in order to save hers," I declared. "And your devotion to her is prompted by what?" he inquired suspiciously. I was silent for a moment. Then I confessed the truth. "My affection." "Ah!" he sighed deeply. "Poor young lady. She, who has enemies on every hand, sadly needs a friend. But can we trust you? Have you no fear?" "Of what?" "Of being implicated in the coming revolution in Russia. Remember, I am the Red Priest. Have you never heard of me? My name is Otto Kampf." Otto Kampf! I stood before him open-mouthed. Who in Russia had not heard of that mysterious unknown person who had directed 100 conspiracies against the imperial autocrat, and yet the identity of whom the police had always failed to discover? It was believed that Kampf had once been professor of chemistry at Moscow University, and that he had invented that most terrible and destructive explosive used by the revolutionists. The ingredients of the powerful compound and the mode of firing it was the secret of the Nihilist alone, and Otto Kampf, the mysterious leader, whose personality was unknown even to the conspirators themselves, directed those constant attempts which held the Emperor and his government in such hourly terror. Rewards without number had been offered by the Ministry of the Interior for the betrayal and arrest of the unseen man whose power in Russia, permeating every class, was greater than that of the Emperor himself, at whose word one day the people would rise in a body and destroy their oppressors. The Emperor, the ministers, the police, and the bureaucrats knew this, yet they were powerless. They knew that the mysterious professor who had disappeared from Moscow 15 years before, and had never since been seen, was only waiting his opportunity to strike a blow that would stagger and crush the empire from end to end. Yet of his whereabouts they were in utter ignorance. "You are surprised," the old man laughed, noticing my amazement. "Well, you are not one of us, yet I need not impress upon you the absolute necessity, for Mademoiselle's sake, to preserve the secret of my existence. It is because you are not a member of the will of the people that you have never heard of the Red Priest. Red, because I wrote my ultimatum to the Czar in the blood of one of his victims knouted in the fortress of Peter and Paul, and Priest, because I preach the gospel of freedom and justice." "I shall say nothing," I said, gazing at the strangely striking figure before me, the unknown man who directed the great upheaval that was to revolutionize Russia. "My only desire is to save Mademoiselle Heath." "And you are prepared to do so at risk of your own liberty, your own life? Ah, you said you love her. Would not this be a test of your affection?" "I am prepared for any test, as long as she escapes the trap which her enemies have set for her. I succeeded in saving her from Kajana, and I intend to save her now." "Was it you who actually entered Kajana and snatched her from that tomb?" he exclaimed. And he took my hand enthusiastically, adding, "I have no further need to doubt you." And turning to the table, he wrote an address upon a slip of paper, saying, "Take Mademoiselle there. She will find a safe place of concealment. But go quickly, for every moment places you both in more deadly peril. Hide yourself there also." I thanked him and left at once, but as I stepped out of the house and re-entered the drosky I saw close by, lurking in the shadow, the spy of the Strangler of Finland, who had traveled with me from Abo. Our eyes met, and he recognized me, notwithstanding my light overcoat and new hat. Then, with heart sinking, the ghastly truth flashed upon me. All had been in vain. Elma was lost to me. End of chapter 13. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 14 of the Czar's Spy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Czar's Spy by William Le Queux. Chapter 14. Her Highness is Inquisitive. Initially, the danger was apparent, and instead of driving back to the hotel, I called out to the man to take me to the Moscow railway station, in order to put the spy off the scent. I knew he would follow me, but as he was on foot and no drosky in sight, I should be able to reach the station before he could, and there elude him. Over the stones we rattled, leaving the lurking agent standing in the deep shadow, but on turning back I saw him dash across the road to a by-street, where in all probability he had a conveyance in waiting. Then, after we had crossed the Neva, I countermanded my order to the man, saying, "Don't go right up to the station. Turn into the Litinoy Prospect to the left, and put me down there. Drive quickly, and I'll pay double fare." He whipped his horses, and we turned into the maze of the dark, ill-lit, narrow streets that lies between the Vosnesenski and the Nevski, turning and winding until we emerged at last into the main thoroughfare again, and then at last we turned into the street I had indicated. A wide road of handsome buildings, where I knew I was certain to be able to instantly get another drosky. I flung the man his money, alighted, and 2 minutes later was driving on towards the Alexander Bridge, traveling in a circle back to the hotel. Time after time I glanced behind, but saw nothing of the Baron's spy, who had evidently gone to the station with all speed, expecting that I was leaving the capital. I found Elma in her room, ready dressed to go out, wearing a long traveling cloak, and in her hand was a small dressing case. She was pale and full of anxiety until I showed her the slip of paper which Otto Kampf had given me with the address written upon it, and then together we hurried forth. The house to which we drove was, we discovered, a large one facing the Fontanka Canal, one of the best quarters of the town, and on descending I asked the liveried dvornick for Madame Zurloff, the name which the Red Priest had written. "You mean the Princess Zurloff," remarked the man through his red beard. "Whom shall I say desires to see her?" "Take that," I said, handing to him the piece of paper which, beside the address, bore a curious cipher mark like 3 triangles joined. He closed the door, leaving us in the wide carpeted hall, the statuary in which showed us that it was a richly furnished place, and when a few minutes later he returned, he conducted us upstairs to a fine gilded salon, where an elderly gray-haired lady in black stood gravely to receive us. "Allow me to present Mademoiselle Elma Heath, Princess," I said, speaking in French and bowing, and afterwards telling her my own name. Our hostess welcomed my love in a graceful speech, but I said, "Mademoiselle unfortunately suffers a terrible affliction. She is deaf and dumb." "Ah, how very, very sad!" she exclaimed sympathetically. "Poor girl, poor girl!" And she placed her hand tenderly upon Elma's shoulder and looked into her eyes. Then, turning to me, she said, "So the Red Priest has sent you both to me. You are in danger of arrest, I suppose. You wish me to conceal you here?" "I would only ask sanctuary for Mademoiselle," was my reply. "For myself I have no fear. I am English, and therefore not a member of the party." "The Mademoiselle fears arrest?" "There is an order signed for her banishment to Saghalien," I said. "She was imprisoned at Kajana, the fortress away in Finland, but I succeeded in liberating her." "She has actually been in Kajana?" gasped the Princess. "Ah, we have all heard sufficient of the horrors of that place. And you liberated her? Why, she is the only person who has ever escaped from that living tomb to which Oberg sends his victims." "I believe so, Princess." "And may I take it, monsieur, that the reason you risked your life for her is because you love her? Pardon me for suggesting this." "You have guessed correctly," I answered. Then, knowing that Elma could not hear, I added, "I love her, but we are not lovers. I have not told her of my affection. Hers is a long and strange story, and she will perhaps tell you something of it in writing." "Well," exclaimed the gray-haired lady, smiling, leading my love across the luxurious room, the atmosphere of which was filled with the scent of flowers, and taking off her cloak with her own hands, "you are safe here, my poor child. If spies have not followed you, then you shall remain my guest as long as you desire." "I am sure it is very good of you, Princess," I said gratefully. "Miss Heath is the victim of a vile and dastardly conspiracy. When I tell you that she has been afflicted, as she is, by her enemies, that an operation was performed upon her in Italy while she was unconscious, you will readily see in what deadly peril she is." "What?" she cried. "Have your enemies actually done this? Horrible!" "She will perhaps tell you of the strange romance that surrounds her, a mystery which I have not yet been able to fathom. She is a Russian subject, although she has been educated in England. Baron Oberg himself is, I believe, her worst and most bitter enemy. Ah, the Strangler!" she explained with a quick flash in her dark eyes. "But his end is near. The movement is active in Helsingfors. At any moment now we may strike our blow for freedom." She was an enthusiastic revolutionist, I could see, unsuspected, however, by the police on account of her high position in Petersburg society. It was she who, as I afterwards discovered, had furnished the large sums of money to Kampf for the continuation of the revolutionary propaganda, and indeed secretly devoted the greater part of her revenues from her vast estates in Samara and Kazan to the Nihilist cause. Her husband himself, an enthusiast of freedom, although of the high nobility, had been killed by a fall from his horse 6 years before, and since that time she had retired from society and lived there quietly, making the revolutionary movement her sole occupation. The authorities believed that her retirement was due to the painful loss she had sustained, and had no suspicion that it was her money that enabled the mysterious Red Priest to slowly but surely complete the plot for the general uprising. She compelled me to remove my coat, and tea was served by a Tartar footman, whose family she explained had been serfs of the Zurloffs for 3 centuries, and then Elma exchanged confidences with her by means of paper and pencil. "Who is this man Martin Woodroffe of whom she speaks?" asked the Princess presently, turning to me. "I have met him twice, only twice," I replied, "and under strange circumstances." Then continuing, I told her something concerning the incidents of the yacht Lola. "He may be in love with her, and desires to force her into marriage," she suggested, expressing amazement at the curious narrative I had related. "I think not, for several reasons. One is because I know she holds some secret concerning him, and another because he is engaged to an English girl named Muriel Leithcourt." "Leithcourt, Leithcourt," repeated the Princess, knitting her brows with a puzzled air. "Do you happen to know her father's name?" "Philip Leithcourt." "And has he actually been living in Scotland?" "Yes," I answered in quick anxiety. "He rented a shoot called Rannoch near Dumfries. A mysterious incident occurred on his estate, a double murder, or murder and suicide, which is not quite clear. But shortly afterwards there appeared one evening at the house a man named Chater, Hilton Chater, and the whole family at once fled and disappeared." Princess Zurloff sat with her lips pressed close together, looking straight at the silent girl before her. Elma had removed her hat and cloak, and now sat in a deep easy-chair of yellow silk, with the lamplight shining on her chestnut hair, settled and calm as though already thoroughly at home. I smiled to myself as I thought of the chagrin of Woodroffe when he returned to find his victim missing. "Your Highness evidently knows the Leithcourts," I hazarded, after a brief silence. "I have heard of them," was her unsatisfactory reply. "I go to England sometimes. When the Prince was alive we were often at Claridge's for the season. The Prince was for 5 years military attaché at the Embassy under de Stael, you know. What I know of the Leithcourts is not to their credit. But you tell me that there was a mysterious incident before their flight. Explain it to me." At that moment the long white doors of the handsome salon were thrown open by the faithful Tartar servitor, and there entered a man whose hair fell over the collar of his heavy overcoat, but whom in an instant I recognized as Otto Kampf. Both Elma and I sprang to our feet, while advancing to the Princess he bent and gallantly kissed the hand she held forth to him. Then he shook hands with Elma, and acknowledging my own greetings, took off his coat and threw it upon a chair with the air of an accustomed visitor. "I come, Princess, in order to explain to you," he said. "Mademoiselle fears rearrest, and the only house in Petersburg that the police never suspect is this. Therefore I send her to you, knowing that with your generosity you will help her in her distress." "It is all arranged," was her Highness's response. "She will remain here, poor girl, until it is safe for her to get out of Russia." Then, after some further conversation, and after my well-beloved had made signs of heartfelt gratitude to the man known from end to end of the Russian Empire as the Red Priest, the Princess turned to me, saying, "I would much like to know what occurred before the Leithcourts left Scotland." "The Leithcourts!" exclaimed Kampf in utter surprise. "Do you know the Leithcourts, and the English officer Durnford?" I looked into his eyes in abject amazement. What connection could Jack Durnford, of the Marines, have with the adventurer Philip Leithcourt? I, however, recollected Jack's word, when I had described the visit of the Lola to Leghorn, And further, I recollected that very shortly he would be back in London from his term of Mediterranean service. "Well," I said after a pause, "I happen to know Captain Durnford very well, but I had no idea that he was friendly with Leithcourt." The Red Priest smiled, stroking his white beard. "Explain to her Highness what she desires to know, and I will tell you." My eyes met Elma's, and I saw how intensely eager and interested she was, watching the movement of my lips and trying to make out what words I uttered. "Well," I said, "a mysterious tragedy occurred on the edge of a wood near the house rented by Leithcourt, a tragedy which has puzzled the police to this day. An Italian named Santini and his wife were found murdered." "Santini!" gasped Kampf, starting up. "But surely he is not dead?" "No, that's the curious part of the affair. The man who was killed was a man disguised to represent the Italian, while the woman was actually the waiter's wife herself. I happen to know the man Santini well, for both he and his wife were for some years in my employ." The Princess and the director of the Russian revolutionary movement exchanged quick glances. It was as though her Highness implored Kampf to reveal to me the truth, while he on his part was averse to doing so. "And upon whom does suspicion rest?" asked her Highness. "As far as I can make out, the police have no clue whatever, except one. At the spot was found a tiny miniature cross of one of the Russian orders of chivalry, the cross of Saint Anne." "There is no suspicion upon Leithcourt?" she asked with some undue anxiety, I thought. "No." "Did he entertain any guests at the shooting box?" "A good many." "No foreigners among them?" "I never met any. They seemed all people from London, a smart set for the most part." "Then why did the Leithcourts disappear so suddenly?" "Because of the appearance of the man Chater," I replied. "It is evident that they feared him, for they took every precaution against being followed. In fact, they fled leaving a big party of friends in the house. The man Woodroffe, now at the Hôtel de Paris, is a friend of Leithcourt as well as of Chater." "He was not a guest of Leithcourt when this man representing Santini was assassinated?" asked Kampf, again stroking his beard. "No. As soon as Woodroffe recognized me as a visitor, he left." "For Hamburg?" "He was afraid to face you because of the ransacking of the British Consul safe at Leghorn," remarked the Princess, who at the same moment took Elma's hand tenderly in her own and looked at her. Then turning to me, she said, "What you have told us to-night, Mr. Gregg, throws a new light upon certain incidents that had hitherto puzzled us. The mystery of it all is a great and inscrutable one, the mystery of this poor unfortunate girl greatest of all. But both of us will endeavor to help you to elucidate it. We will help poor Elma to crush her enemies, these cowardly villains who had maimed her." "Ah, Princess," I cried, "if you will only help and protect her, you will be doing an act of mercy to a defenseless woman. I love her, I admit it. I have done my utmost. I have striven to solve the dark mystery, but up to the present I have been unsuccessful, and have only remained, even till to-day, the victim of circumstance." "Let her stay with me," the kindly woman answered, smiling tenderly upon my love. "She will be safe here, and in the meantime we will endeavor to discover the real and actual truth." And in response I took the Princess's hand and pressed it fervently. Although that striking white-headed man and the rather stiff, formal woman in black were the leaders of the great and all-powerful movement in Russia known through the civilized world as the Terror, yet they were, nevertheless, our friends. They had pledged themselves to help us thwart our enemies. I scribbled a few hasty words upon paper and handed it to Elma, and for answer she smiled contentedly, looking into my eyes with an expression of trust, devotion, and love. Chapter 14. Recording by Tom Weiss.